He kissed her before he knew her name. What Hester Loveday could never explain, not to the woman who employed her, not to the court that would later write her name into its records, not even to herself in the gray hours before the household woke,
My dear Miss Loveday, the
was that
refreshments are
she had
exquisite
been the
tonight.
one
Yes, sir, quite.
carrying the
A pity
very
about the
thing
shipment
he
from the
came
West
into
Indies.
that
Did the new one
corridor
arrive?
saying.
It did, sir. Quite
She had
fresh.
taken the wrong turning, that was all. A house she did not know well, borrowed shoes that pinched, and a blue leather
Parcel for
case she had been
collection,
told to
Mistress
bring
Loveday.
upstairs and
Duly
had
noted.
never once thought to open. It was the 13th of February in 1840, 3 days after the Queen had married, and every passage in the house was crowded with florists and footmen and ladies with sharp elbows and sharper opinions. Hester Loveday was none of those.
Did
She
you
was a
truly
companion.
believe this would
She
improve
wrote the
matters?
letters her mistress signed.
It is chaos.
She was
I meant
very
well by
good
it.
at not being
I truly
seen
did.
and considerably
Help us!
worse
No!
at finding her
He's
way
hurting her!
through the
Somebody
servants'
help!
passages of
What
a
in
house on
God's name is
Bryanston
going on
Square.
up there? Wake up!
So she
Help
heard the
them!
footsteps before she understood them. Two sets from opposite ends of the passage, both moving far too quickly for a wedding day. She pressed herself flat against the cold wall. Then a man came round the corner at speed, and his hand was at her jaw, and the case was crushed between them, and the boots behind her slowed, paused, and walked on. He stepped back exactly 2 knuckles' width. He asked her to forgive him. His voice was low and entirely unhurried. He did not look at her face. He looked at the case. The morning had begun in a church, and it had begun well. St. George's on Hanover Square was full by 10:30, which was remarkable for a February wedding, and would have been remarkable in any month but this one. London had not emptied since Monday. The Queen had married her prince on the 10th, and the city was still thick with people who had come in for the spectacle and found no reason to go home. There were flags in Conduit Street that nobody had taken down, sodden now and graying at the edges. Hester Loveday stood at the back of the church, near the vestry door, where she could see the aisle and the door to the registry at the same time. She had never once in 4 years sat in the family pews, and it had not occurred to her to want to. She was there because at some point in the next hour somebody would need something, and the person who needed it would look round for her without knowing they were looking, and she intended to be already moving by the time they did. Miss Charlotte Merivale, who was 19, wept twice and recovered both times. Sir Gilbert Atwood, who had been a captain in the 45th Foot before his father died and made a baronet of him, did not weep at all, but his hands were unsteady on the rail, and he had to be prompted through the second half of his vow. Hester liked him for that. The party moved through to the registry at 11:15, and that was where the morning nearly went wrong. The clerk had prepared the entry in advance, as clerks do, so that the signing would be quick. He had written the grooms' names in a fair, careful hand, Sir Gilbert Auberon Atwood, except that he had written Aubrey. Hester saw it from 4 feet away and upside down, which she could do, because she had been reading documents upside down across a table since she was 14. She did not say anything. Speaking would have made it an event, and an event on a wedding morning becomes a story, and a story attaches itself to a marriage and stays there for 40 years. Instead, she stepped in as though to steady the book, turned it a quarter turn, laid one finger on the paper an inch from the error, and looked up at the clerk. He was young and he was quick. He saw her finger, then the word, then his own mistake. He drew the register towards him, cut the false letters out with 2 strokes of a penknife, wrote the true ones above, sanded it, and initialed the alteration in the margin. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. The bride was still arranging her sleeve. Sir Gilbert signed. Miss Merivale signed and became Lady Atwood. The witnesses signed. Nobody noticed anything at all, which was the point. Afterwards, the clerk found Hester in the porch, and thanked Mrs. Merivale for her attentiveness, because he assumed, quite naturally, that the woman standing beside Mrs. Merivale was an extension of Mrs. Merivale. Mrs. Augusta Merivale accepted the thanks with great warmth and no idea whatever what she was being thanked for. Hester had a penknife of her own in her pocket, and 3 quills wrapped in a fold of linen, because she did not trust other people's pens and had never once in her life written a word with a steel nib. Her father had taught her to cut a quill in the winter of 1825 at the kitchen table in Ashburton, and he had taught her by touch rather than by sight, because by that winter he could no longer see the knife in his own hand. He had been a solicitor's clerk. He had gone blind at 41 and lived 11 years after, and for all 11 of them his daughter had been his eyes and his right hand. She had learned which paper came from which mill, and how a wax seal behaves when it has been lifted and pressed down again, and how a man's writing changes on the 3rd page when he begins to be honest, and she had learned it the way other children learn the names of birds, without ever deciding to. He had died in the spring of 1836. She had been 25. 6 weeks later she had entered the service of Mrs. Augusta Merivale of Bryanston Square, and in those 4 years she had written every letter Mrs. Merivale signed. That was not a secret, and it was not a scandal. Mrs. Merivale had opinions and no patience, and a hand that tired after half a page, and a companion who could take a mumbled instruction across a breakfast table and turn it into 3 paragraphs that sounded exactly like Mrs. Merivale on her very best day. Her charities ran that way. Her disputes with tradesmen ran that way. Her friendships, several of them decades old, were maintained entirely that way. Hester had decided long ago that this did not trouble her. She had been somebody's hand before. It was better paid than most things a woman of 29 with no family and no fortune could get, and it was warm indoors, and nobody shouted at her. She was still thinking about the register when she noticed the man at the back of the church. He stood to the left of the west door, alone, in a dark coat, very tall, and he had not moved once in 20 minutes. That was not what she noticed. What she noticed was that he had not looked at the bride. Everyone looks at the bride. That is the whole architecture of the morning. Even the men who pretend to be bored look at the bride, because it is the one permitted way of looking at a woman in a room full of witnesses. He was watching the groom, and had been since before the ceremony began, with an attention that had nothing warm in it, and nothing hostile either. It was the attention of a man reading a page he has been given very little time to read. Then the recessional began, and the church stood up, and by the time the aisle had cleared, he was gone. Bryanston Square swallowed the wedding party at 1 o'clock and did not release it until nearly midnight. The house was not equal to the number of people in it. Mrs. Merivale had invited 40 more guests than the rooms could hold, on the grounds that a crowded house looks like a successful house and an empty one looks like a warning. There were florists still working on the stairs at 2 in the afternoon, and 3 men in the back passage arguing about ice. She spent the first 2 hours moving. She found Lady Atwood's second pair of gloves in the 3rd box, and not the first. She moved the seating at the long table by 4 places, quietly, before anyone sat down, because Mr. Hallows and Mr. Dean had not spoken since a matter concerning a horse in 1837, and there was no reason to test it now. At a little past 3, the housekeeper found her on the first landing. "The blue case," the housekeeper said. "It has come up out of the strong room with the plate, and it should not have. It wants to go back to the writing room on the 2nd floor before somebody puts a glass on it." Hester knew the case. She had known it since the end of November. In the particular way, she knew a great many things she had never been told directly. It was flat blue leather, about the size of a folio ledger, with 2 straps and a lock that had never once been turned. It had arrived in the last week of November, and nobody at Bryanston Square had ever opened it. She knew this because in November she had written the letter that agreed to keep it. She could have recited that letter. Mrs. Merivale had given her the sense of it in 9 words over the breakfast table, and Hester had made it into 4 courteous sentences about the pleasure of being of service and the entire discretion upon which the correspondent might rely. She had never asked what was in the case, because it was not her business, and because in 4 years she had learned that the fastest way to stay useful in a house is to be a person who does not ask. She took the case under her arm and went up. The main stair was blocked by 2 footmen and a table. She went instead through the door at the end of the landing into the service passage, which she had used perhaps a dozen times, and which she had never once used while carrying something and thinking about something else. The passage behind the dry store ran the length of the house and turned twice. She took the second turn instead of the first. The change was immediate. Behind her there had been orange flower and hot wax and the noise of 200 people being pleased with themselves. Here there was cold stone and old candle grease, and the noise came through the wall, flattened and far away, like weather in another county. She stopped. She turned to go back, and she heard the footsteps. 2 sets, one behind her, one ahead, both quick and both with purpose, which was the part that made her press herself flat against the wall without deciding to. Servants in a full house move quickly. They do not move like that. There is a difference between hurry and hunting, and her body understood it before her mind had assembled a reason. The man from ahead came round the corner so fast that he nearly went into her. She had an impression of height, of a dark coat and a colder smell than the house, wet wool and outside air, as though he had come in from the street within the last few minutes, of a face she did not have time to see. Then his hand was at her jaw, tilting her face up, and his mouth came down on hers. It was not gentle, and it was not rough. That was the thing she came back to afterwards without ever finding the word for it. It was deliberate, a hand that did not shake and a breath that did not catch, and a man who had made a decision half a second before he made it and was now committing to it entirely. Hester did not move. The case was crushed flat between them, and the corner of it dug into her ribs, and she did not move. Behind her, the boots came on. A heavy tread with iron on the heels, the walk of a man who had been taught to move that way years ago and had never stopped. They came up the passage. They slowed. They stopped, some yards back, for what could not have been more than 2 seconds, and was one of the longer intervals of her life. Then they went on, past the turn and away. He released her. He stepped back exactly 2 knuckles' width, no more, which she noticed and did not understand for another 3 months, perhaps 36. Dark hair going early to gray at the left temple. A face that did not rearrange itself for her benefit. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was low and entirely unhurried. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed and not at all accustomed to apologizing, which meant the apology was probably real, since he had clearly had no practice at making a false one sound well. Hester was not, as a rule, a woman who lost her words. But she stood in that passage, with her heart going, and said nothing, because she had seen the ring on his right hand as he lowered it, and she had spent 3 days addressing invitations with that crest pressed into the corner in gold. He was watching her with an expression she could not read. Not alarm, not embarrassment, something more like attention. "The man who has just gone past," she said, when she got her voice back, was looking for something, not for somebody. Something moved across his face very slightly. "Why do you say that?" he said. "Because he came up this passage twice before the ceremony this morning," Hester said. "Once at 10 and once at 1/2 past, and both times he slowed where the dry store is, and both times he went on again. A man looking for a person walks at one speed and looks at faces. A man looking for a thing walks at 2 speeds and looks at furniture." When he spoke again, the quality of his attention had changed, and she felt it the way one feels a door open in another room. "You were counting his steps," he said. "I was in the passage at 10 and at 1/2 past. I notice what passes me. It is my trade. And what is your trade?" "People do not look at me," Hester said. "They look through me. I am paid a good deal of money to make sure that keeps happening." The corner of his mouth moved very slightly and settled again. "Then I would advise you to earn it for the next quarter of an hour," he said. "Go back the way you came. Do not use this passage again today. And do not tell anybody in this house that you saw me in it." He went past her, taking the turn she had originally meant to take, moving with the same swift and entirely silent certainty with which he had arrived. And she stood there afterwards, with the crushed case against her chest, understanding, for the first time, what had been wrong with the whole encounter. When he stepped back from her, he had not looked at her face. He had looked at the case. Her room was on the 3rd floor at the back, over the yard, and she did not reach it until nearly 6. She put the case on the bed and stood looking at it for rather a long time. She had been told to take it to the writing room. She had not taken it to the writing room. She had carried it up 2 flights and along a corridor into her own room, and she had done it without making the decision anywhere she could see. She undid the first strap. There was one thing inside. Not a bundle of papers, not a settlement, not the deeds and drafts she had half expected. One thing, lying flat at the bottom, so ordinary that for a moment she thought the case was empty. It was the outer cover of a letter, used, opened, the seal broken, and the sheet unfolded and pressed flat again, the way a careful man flattens a paper he means to keep. The letter itself was gone. Somebody had kept the wrapping and thrown away the words. Hester carried it to the window and turned it to the last of the light. The address was written across it in a strong hand, and in the upper corner, in the same hand, were the 3 things the law required: the name of the post town, the date, the signature, Marlborough, October the 21st, 1839, and a peer's name, written out full. She knew what she was holding. Everybody in England knew. A franc. Until 5 weeks ago, a peer or a member of Parliament could send a letter anywhere in the kingdom for nothing, and all he had to do was write the address in his own hand and add the town and the day and sign it. The rich had sent letters for nothing, and the poor had paid a shilling to hear that their mother had died. The address on the cover was in Newport, in Monmouthshire. Hester sat down on the edge of the bed. She knew what the newspapers had said in November. Several thousand working men had come down out of the hills in the rain and gone at the Westgate Hotel, and soldiers of the 45th had fired on them from inside the windows, and more than 20 had died in the street. The man Frost had been taken, and London had been holding its breath ever since, in the particular way a city holds its breath when it has decided to be frightened. She looked at the cover again, and this time she looked at it as her father had taught her to, which was to say, she stopped reading it and began examining it. 3 things. The paper had a watermark. She held it up and found the crown and the maker's name and, low in the corner, the year. The signature had a tremor, and the tremor came in the wrong place. A man signing his own name signs it as one movement, and the pen is fastest at the end where the flourish is. This one had slowed at the end, the way a hand slows when it is copying something and comes to the part it is not sure of. And on the reverse, struck small and clear in red, was the receiving stamp of the post office. It did not say Marlborough. It said Devizes. Hester sat with it on her knee in the gray light. She had addressed enough letters into Wiltshire to know that the two towns were something like 12 miles apart, and she knew there was a rule about it somewhere, and she could not for the moment remember what the rule was. She folded the cover along its old creases, put it back, and did the straps up. She did not know what it meant, or who it damaged, or why a man who had come in out of the rain had put his hand on her face rather than let another man see what she carried. She knew one thing, and she knew it the way one knows a burn. Somebody had been prepared to hunt through a house of 200 people to find this, and she had carried it under her arm all afternoon, past the flowers and the ice and the cake, saying, "Excuse me and thank you, and mind the step." She put the case at the back of the shelf in her cupboard, behind the winter boots, and went down to the evening. The evening party was the part of the day Mrs. Merivale actually cared about. The wedding had been for the family and the church and the newspapers. The evening was for the rooms, and the rooms filled at 9 and were still full at midnight. And Hester moved through them for 3 hours with a list in her head and nothing in her hands, which was how she preferred to work. Half the county families in the West had come up for the Queen's wedding and had stayed, and Sir Gilbert had a great many friends from the regiment, and Mrs. Merivale had invited everyone she had ever met on a committee. The result was a house full of strangers who all vaguely knew one another, which is the most dangerous kind of party there is, and Hester spent most of it standing near doorways and preventing things. It was a little after 11 when a man she did not know said her father's name. "Miss Loveday," he said, "you will not know me. I am Ignatius Vellacott. I sit for Marlbrook, and I am told on excellent authority that you are the reason Mrs. Merivale's committee has not collapsed into open warfare these 3 years." He was perhaps 58, silver-haired, not tall, with the comfortable stillness of a man who had long ago stopped needing to establish anything. His coat was good and not new. Under his voice there was a West Country softness that had been mostly, though not entirely, filed away. "Mrs. Merivale is a very capable woman," Hester said. "Mrs. Merivale is a very determined woman," said Mr. Vellacott, "which is a different quality and a rarer one. And it is not the quality that writes minutes." He smiled. It was an easy smile, and it reached his eyes, which was the part she thought about afterwards. "Somebody writes those minutes. I have read 4 years of them, and they are better than the minutes of the Board of Ordnance." Hester said nothing at all, which is what she usually said. "I knew a Loveday once," he went on, "clerk to a solicitor in Devon. Ashburton, I think it was, or near it. Went blind, poor fellow, at the height of his usefulness. I do not suppose there is any connection." "He was my father," Hester said. "Ah," said Mr. Vellacott. And that was all he said, and the silence was well judged, because it did the work of a great deal of sympathy without requiring him to say anything she would have had to be grateful for. Then he asked her about the soup kitchen at Bethnal Green. She could talk about the soup kitchen at Bethnal Green. She had written something like 50 letters about it. She knew what the coal cost and what it ought to cost, and she found herself talking for rather longer than she had intended, because he asked his questions in the right order and did not once look over her shoulder at the room. It was pleasant. That was the honest word for it. It was pleasant to be asked. And then, in exactly the same tone, in the middle of a sentence about coal, he said, "Where do you put the house's letters in?" "I beg your pardon. Mrs. Merivale's post. Forgive me, it is a dull thing to ask, but the committee's correspondence has been going astray at the Bethnal Green end." Do you use a receiving house, or does it go straight to the chief office? There is a tobacconist in Holborn, Hester said. We have used him since '38. He takes in and he gives out. Vellacott nodded slowly. Dunnage, he said. Yes, that would be it. You know him. I recommended him, said Mr. Vellacott, and laughed at himself, comfortably. The laugh of a man confessing to a small vanity. 2 years ago, or thereabouts, Mrs. Merivale was complaining of the price of the chief office, and I told her there was an honest man in Holborn who would do it for less. I hope he has not let me down. He has never let anybody down that I know of, Hester said. Good, said Mr. Vellacott. Good. I am glad. He talked to her for 2 minutes more, about nothing, and then somebody claimed him and he went off across the room with his hand out and his name already on his lips, for a man he had not seen in a year. Hester stood where she was. She could not have said what was wrong. Nothing had been wrong. He had been kind and interested, and he had known her father's name, and he had asked one dull question about the post and had answered it himself before she finished. But she had the distinct and unpleasant sensation of a man having opened a drawer somewhere in her, looked at what was in it, and closed it again very quietly, so as not to wake her. The card came the following morning before 10. She had expected, if she expected anything, one of 2 things: nothing, which was likely, or a secretary's hand on stiff paper, 6 lines of exact courtesy, naming a time and a place, and communicating nothing whatever. What came was neither. It was a plain card, and the hand was not a secretary's. It was strong and quick, and it sloped a little oddly to the right, as though the writer's grip were not quite square on the pen, and it had been made by a man who wrote a great deal and had long ago stopped trying to make it beautiful. There were 2 lines. There is a man who does not wish me well, and you were the only person in that house yesterday who saw what was happening in it. I should also like to take tea with you. That is separate from the first thing, and I mean it separately. And beneath it, one initial and a name she already knew. Hester read it twice. Then she sat down, which she did not often do in the middle of a working morning, and which the housemaid noticed and mentioned in the kitchen later. She knew the shape of correspondence from important people. It flattered, or it instructed, or it did both at once and pretended to do neither. It never said a plain thing, because a plain thing can be quoted. This had said 2 plain things and had troubled to point out that they were 2. She took a sheet, cut a fresh point on the second of her quills, and wrote her answer standing up. I am free at 11 tomorrow. The breakfast room on the south side of this house is not used before 1 and has 1 door. I would suggest it in preference to a tea room. Given the nature of your first line, I assume you would rather not be seen crossing a public floor in my direction. She gave it to the footman she trusted, and then did her work for the rest of the day, entirely competently, with a perfectly calm face. He came at 11 exactly. She had half expected him to be diminished by a smaller room. He was not. He simply arrived, and the room adjusted, and she thought that she had met perhaps 4 people in her life who did that and had liked none of the other 3. The breakfast room faced south over the little garden and had glass along one side, and at that hour in February the light came through low and thin and the color of weak tea. 2 chairs, a table between them, and on the table a pot and 2 cups. He looked at the room before he looked at her. Door, window. The wall against the neighboring house, the corridor behind. 1 entrance, he said. And nothing above us until the afternoon, Hester said. The room over this one is a linen room, and it is done at 9. If you speak in an ordinary voice, you will not be heard through the door. You have measured it. I have lived in this house 4 years, she said, and there are 9 rooms in it where a conversation cannot be had. He sat down. He did not settle. She had the impression that settling was not a thing he did in company, and perhaps not much out of it. Then he reached over and poured the tea. Hester watched him do it and said nothing until both cups were full. "Dukes do not pour," she said. "I am aware of what dukes do." "Then why?" "Because there is nobody else in the room," said Gervase Ashcombe, setting the pot down again, "and I find the rules useful in public and an obstruction in private." "This is private." He looked up. "Also, I would rather not begin by asking you to do something for me while you are also doing something for me. It would set the wrong terms." Hester picked up her cup. "Tell me about the man with the iron heels," she said. He told it the way a good witness tells a thing, in order and without decoration, and without once making his own position sound graver than it was. She noticed that. In her experience, powerful men did not describe their difficulties. They performed them. There had been a colonel of the 45th Foot named Bartholomew Wraxall. He had been inside the Westgate on the 4th of November, and he had been hit twice and had lived 5 days and had died on the 9th. He was 44 and a widower, and he had left one daughter, Adela, who was 8, and something like £30,000 in consols. On the 7th of November, from his bed, Wraxall had sent Gervase Ashcombe a packet. "What was in it?" Hester said. "Nothing that would interest a jury by itself. A ledger of 2 pages, 4 used covers, of which 3 are in a bank in Lombard Street, and the 4th is in your cupboard, since I assume that is where it is. I did not care to keep the 4 of them in one place. It is behind my boots. That is better than I hoped for." And a statement in his own hand, 4 sheets, describing a room above a stationer's shop in Bristol in the 2nd week of October. He drank some of his tea. "There is a manufactory," he said. 6 men, perhaps 8. What they make is francs. Covers by the 100, addressed in a good imitation of a peer's hand, with the post town and the day and the signature all complete, and they have been making them for years. Hester set her cup down. "To send letters for nothing," she said. "That is what anybody would assume. It is a cheap crime, and half the country has committed some version of it. And if that were all it was, Wraxall would have written to the post office and gone back to his regiment, and I should never have heard his name. Then what is it?" He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was not composure. "Consider what a used cover is," he said. "A man's name, a date, a town, the address of the person he wrote to, and a stamp from the post office proving that it traveled. It is a receipt, and it is a receipt that is not kept by the man and is not kept by the post office. It is kept by whoever happens to be holding it. The address on mine is Newport," Hester said. "Yes." She sat very still. "They were made before," she said, "not after." He inclined his head, and she understood that she had done something that pleased him, and that he did not intend to say so. "The covers in Wraxall's packet are dated across 2 years," he said. "All of them addressed into Monmouthshire and the valleys above it, to men whose names have been in every newspaper in England since November, and everyone signed by somebody who sits in the Lords or the Commons. 14 names I can identify. Mine is one of them." Hester heard the coal shift in the grate and did not look at it. "So after the rising," she said slowly, "a man could produce a drawer full of paper, proving that 14 peers and members had been in correspondence with the Chartists of Newport for 2 years before it happened." "Yes, none of it true." "Not one line," he said. "There is no letter. There never was a letter. There is only the wrapping, which is the only part anybody keeps, and the wrapping says what the man who made it decided it should say." "And what does he want?" Hester said. "He has not used them." "He has used 2, said Gervase Ashcombe. "And both of those men have voted since November in ways that surprise the people who know them best. He does not want us ruined. A ruined man is of no further use. He wants us obedient for the next 20 years. and he has been building the means of it since 1837, with a patience I find genuinely impressive. Then why is he hurrying now? Because on the 10th of January, he said, the whole thing died in a single night. He said it quite flatly, and then he said the rest. And Hester listened and felt something in her mind go over like a page turning. The franking privilege had been abolished on the 10th of January, and from that morning a letter went anywhere in England for 1 penny paid by the sender. No more signing. No more free carriage. A peer's name on a cover was worth nothing after that date, and a cover made with a date after it was not a weapon but a confession, because the post office would have charged the letter as an ordinary letter and stamped it accordingly. What he has in his drawers on the 9th of January is what he will have for the rest of his life, said Gervase Ashcombe. And a stock that cannot be replaced must be spent quickly and before anybody works out where it came from. Hester said, "You voted for it." He looked at her. "The penny postage," she said. "The abolition. It went through the Lords in August." "You voted for it." "I did," he said. "I spoke for it briefly and badly. I thought it was a small good thing that would let poor men hear from their children." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the saucer without drinking from it. "I did not learn what else I had done until Wraxall's packet reached me in November." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Hester said, "He did not send a man into this house yesterday to find you." "No, he sent him to find a blue leather case." "Yes," said Gervase Ashcombe. "Then he learned of it only lately," Hester said. And she was not looking at him now. She was looking at the middle of the table and building it as she went. He knew the house but not the room, or he would have gone straight up. He knew the case but not who was carrying it, or he would not have walked that passage 3 times in a morning. And he came on the one day this year when 200 strangers were in the house and every door in it stood open. She looked up. Somebody told him within the last week or two. Somebody who knew where you had put it and did not know exactly where it was standing. Gervase Ashcombe sat back in his chair. "Miss Loveday," he said, "will you show me the cover?" She went up and got it, and brought it down under a folded shawl and set it on the table between the 2 cups. He did not touch it at first. He looked at it lying there for what felt like a long time. Then he turned it over, read the frank in the corner, and she watched the whole of his face stop. She had seen men take bad news before. There was usually noise in it somewhere, even from the quiet ones. There was none in this. He went still in a way that was more alarming than shouting, and when he spoke his voice had come down half a tone. "That is my name," he said. Hester had known it since the previous evening, or had suspected it, or had known it and declined to finish the thought. Seeing it land on him was a different thing. "Marlborough," he said. "The 21st of October, 1839. Where were you?" "At Ellingcourt," he said, "in Wiltshire. From the 11th of October until the 2nd of November, without 1 day away, because my mother was dying in the West Wing, and I did not leave the house." He set one finger beside the signature without touching it. 9 servants, a physician, and my cousin Sebastian were in that house for 3 weeks, and any of them will swear to it. I wrote 4 letters in the whole of that month, and none of them to Wales. "Then the frank is false," Hester said. "Of course the frank is false." He looked up at her, and there was something almost like humor in it, and no comfort at all. "That is the difficulty, Miss Loveday. Every man whose name is on those covers can say exactly what I have just said, in exactly that tone, and the more of us who say it, the worse we all sound. There is no arrangement of words that gets a man out of it. There is only the paper." Hester picked up the cover. "Then look at the paper," she said. She turned it so the light from the window came through it and showed him the watermark. And then she turned it again and put her finger on the small red stamp on the reverse. Marlborough is written in the corner, she said. The post office received it at Devizes. He said nothing. A franc was good only if the letter went in at the town the signer named on the day he named, she said. That was the whole of the rule, and it was the only thing keeping the privilege honest. A clerk would have charged this as an ordinary letter the moment he saw the two stamps together. Then why did nobody? Said Gervase Ashcombe slowly. Because nobody was ever meant to see them together, Hester said. The franc is read at the counter when the letter goes in. The receiving stamp is struck on the back afterwards. The man who reads the front is not the man who strikes the back, and the man who gets the letter reads neither, because he is reading the letter. She put it down. There is only one moment in the whole life of a letter when somebody looks at the front and the back at once. And when is that? When somebody has kept the cover and thrown away the letter, said Hester. She watched him understand it, and it was not pleasant to watch, because what he understood was that the men who built this had been more careful than he had, and had still made one mistake. And the mistake had been sitting in a cupboard behind a pair of boots. 12 miles, he said at last. 12, and it may not be the only one. There are 4 covers in the packet you spoke of. Look at all 4. If one was struck at the right town on the right day, this is carelessness, and it means very little. Then whoever signs these has never in 2 years been in the county he writes from, and he is doing the whole of it in one room, and the room is not in Wiltshire. Gervase Ashcombe looked at her across the table for a long moment. Miss Loveday, he said, why did you not put this case in the writing room where you were sent? She had been waiting for that question since 11 o'clock, and she did not have a comfortable answer to it. I do not know, she said. That is not true. No, she agreed. It is not. Because a man put his hand on my face in a corridor to stop somebody looking at it, and I wanted to know why. That is the whole of it. There is nothing better underneath. Then may I tell you why, he said, and I would ask you to hear all of it, because you will not like the middle, and you will like the end less. Hester put her hands in her lap. Go on, she said. The man in the corridor is called Elias Sleeth, he said. He was a sergeant. He is now a confidential clerk, and he is very good at what he does. Yesterday he was not looking for me. He was looking for a woman carrying a blue leather case, because that was the whole of his instruction. He knew there was a woman. He knew a case had come up out of the strong room. He would have had that within the hour. He did not know which woman. Then he stopped, and Hester saw him decide to say the next part properly rather than gently. There is a thing a man can do in a crowded house, he said, that makes every other person in the passage look away and keep walking, and it works because nobody wants to be the witness to it. Had Sleeth come round that corner and seen a woman standing against a wall holding a case, he would have looked at the case. Coming round it and seeing what he did see, he looked at the floor and went past. And afterwards he would remember a footman and a housemaid, and no case at all. Hester found that her voice was quite level. You used me, she said. I used the situation, he said, and then, after a moment, no. That is a lawyer's answer, and you deserve better. I used you. I had about half a second, and I used you and I did not ask. And I would like to say that I am sorry, but I am aware that a man saying he is sorry in that particular circumstance is chiefly asking to be forgiven, and I have not earned that in a day. She said nothing. That is the middle, he said. Here is the end. He put one hand flat on the table beside the blue case. That case is in this house because I asked for it to be, he said. At the end of November, 3 weeks after Wraxall's packet reached me, I wrote to Mrs. Merivale and asked whether she would keep something of mine in her strong room for the winter, and she wrote back and said she would. Hester went cold all the way down. I know she wrote back, she said. I wrote it. I beg your pardon. I wrote it, Hester said. Mrs. Merivale gave me 9 words at the breakfast table, and I made 4 sentences of it, and I addressed it, and I sealed it, and I said that you might rely upon our entire discretion, and I did not ask what was in the case because it was not my business. The room was extremely quiet. She watched him work it through, and she saw that he arrived somewhere she had not expected, because what came into his face was not triumph and was not even surprise. It was recognition. "Then I have done you a considerably greater wrong than I knew half an hour ago," he said. "Yes," said Hester. "I chose this house because I had 4 years of correspondence out of it and had formed a high opinion of the mind at the other end. I thought, here is a household that will put a thing in a strong room and forget it." He looked at the case, and in doing it, I put the thing into the hands of the one person in the house who would notice everything about it. "You put it into my hands," Hester said, "and I signed for it in my own writing, and I did not know I was doing it." He did not defend himself. That was the thing she came back to afterwards. He did not tell her it was not so bad. He did not tell her he had had no choice. He did not offer her money, which she had been braced for, and which would have finished it. He said, "You are entirely at liberty never to speak to me again. If that is what you want, say so now, and I will take the case out of this house within the hour, and you will not hear my name again except in the newspapers." Hester Loveday looked at the blue leather case on the table between the 2 cold cups of tea. She thought about 11 years of being somebody's hands, and 4 years of writing another woman's opinions in another woman's name, and the drawer that a pleasant man with a West Country voice had opened in her the night before and closed again very quietly. She had been standing in the middle of somebody else's arrangement since November without knowing it, and the only reason she knew it now was that a man had made one bad decision very fast and had then told her the truth about it while looking at her. "I will speak to you," she said. Something in his shoulders altered. "But not on those terms," Hester said. "If I am in this, I am in it from the front and not from behind. You tell me first, not afterwards, when it has gone wrong and you need me to understand why. First, before you decide if there is time, and immediately after if there is not." "That is not how I have conducted my affairs," he said. "I am aware," she said. "I have read your handwriting." And Gervase Ashcombe, 5th Duke of Ellingcourt, put out his hand across the table like a man closing a bargain in a market, which no duke of her acquaintance would have done, and said, "Then that is the arrangement." She took it. Afterwards, when he had gone and the tea had been cleared, and she had put the blue case back behind her boots because he had asked her to keep it 2 days longer, Hester stood at the window and looked out at the little garden with its 4 dead rose bushes and its wet gravel. She had not told him about Mr. Vellacott. There had been no reason to. Mr. Vellacott had asked her about coal and about her father, and about a tobacconist in Holborn, and had been kind and had gone away. She thought about it for perhaps a minute, standing there. Then she went down to the housekeeper's room to settle the accounts for the ice, and did not think about it again for 19 days. 2 days later, she went to Ellingcourt House for the first time, and before she would look at a single paper, she made him listen to her. She had prepared it. She had prepared it on the walk from the corner of St. James's Square, and she delivered it standing in the middle of his study, with her bonnet still in her hand. "My father was a solicitor's clerk in Ashburton," she said. "My mother taught the pianoforte. I have no title, no fortune, and no family name that anybody in your world would recognize if you said it aloud in a room. I am 29. I am paid £18 a year and my keep, and when I am too old to be useful, I shall have nothing at all, and I have known that since I was 25, and it does not frighten me as much as you would think." He had risen when she came in. He did not sit down again. "I am telling you this," she said, "because you are about to ask me to look at your household, And once I have looked at it, I shall know things about you that your own mother did not know. And you should decide now whether you want that." "Go on," he said. "I will not be easy to manage. I shall contradict you. I shall tell you when you are wrong, and I shall do it in front of your servants if the alternative is letting you act on it. I shall notice things you would rather nobody noticed, and I shall not keep quiet about them, because your title makes silence look like the safer choice." She stopped. Her hands were perfectly steady on the bonnet. "If what you want is a clever woman who will find out one name for you and then go back to Bryanston Square and never mention it again, say so now. I will do it, and I will do it well, and I will not think less of you. But do not agree to my terms this morning and discover in April that you did not mean them." Gervase Ashcombe looked at her for a moment. "If I had wanted quiet," he said, "I would have sent back a courteous card after the corridor and never seen you again. I did not do that. I wrote you 2 true things in my own hand, and I came to your breakfast room, and I poured your tea, and I told you a thing about myself yesterday that I have not told my own cousin." He came round the desk. "I am not agreeing to your terms because I am generous," he said. "I am agreeing because I have been surrounded for a dozen years by men who tell me what I have already decided, and it has very nearly ruined me, and I would like to see what the other thing is like." "Then we may begin," said Hester. Ellingcourt House was not what she had expected, which she was beginning to understand was the ordinary condition of everything to do with its owner. She had expected grandeur of the declarative kind, the sort that men build when they want a house to make an argument on their behalf. What she found was a house that had been furnished by somebody who intended to live in it. The chairs had been sat in. The books had been read and shelved by subject rather than by binding, and 3 of them were lying open face down on a table, which would have given her father palpitations. And in the study, on the wall to the right of the fireplace, there were boxes. They ran from floor to shoulder height in a plain deal case, and each box was labeled on the end in a strong hand that sloped a little oddly to the right, and each label carried a year: 1829, 1830, 1831. On the shelf beneath them lay 4 bound volumes with the same hand on their spines, and when she looked more closely she saw that they were indexes. He kept his letters, not in a lumber room and not in a chest in a cellar. He kept them where a man sitting in the chair by the fire could put out his hand and reach 1834 without standing up. Hester looked at that arrangement for perhaps 4 seconds, and then looked away from it, because staring at a man's private habits in his own study is a discourtesy, and because she had work to do. She met the 3 men that morning. Gideon Peele was 41, the personal secretary, lean and exact, with the gray watchful look of somebody who had spent 2 decades being essential and unnoticed. He answered every question in the fewest possible words, and he answered all of them correctly. He knew what the Duke had done on any given day of the last 4 years, and he knew it without consulting anything. He was, Hester thought, precisely like a clock, and she noticed that she had thought it as a criticism and could not immediately say why. Barnaby Trent was 56 and managed the estate accounts, and he contradicted his employer 3 times in the first 10 minutes. He did it about a drainage bill, a tenancy, and the price of lime. He was rude, he was certain, and he held every paper at an odd distance from his face. Hester disliked him within a minute and told herself that this was not evidence. Sebastian Ashcombe was 33 and was the Duke's cousin, and he came in without knocking, sat on the arm of a chair, and looked at her for a while. "You are the woman from the wedding," he said. "I am." "And what do you want out of this, Sebastian?" said the Duke. "It is a fair question," said Hester. She turned to face him properly. "If I say nothing, you will not believe me. If I name a figure, you will believe me and think less of me. So I will tell you the true answer, which is that a man put me in the middle of something without asking, and I dislike being moved about like furniture. And the fastest way to stop being furniture is to become necessary. Sebastian Ashcombe considered this. That is the first honest answer anybody has given me in this house since November, he said, and went out again. She asked on the second day for the one book that nobody had thought to offer her. Not the correspondence, not the estate ledgers. She asked for the postage book. Peel did not immediately understand her. It took him 3 sentences. Every large household in England kept one, and had kept one for a century, for the simple reason that until the 10th of January, a letter was paid for by the person who received it. Letters arrived, and money went out of the house to pay for them. And money that goes out of a house is entered in a book. Every letter, every charge. 7 pence from Bristol, 10 pence from York, 1 and 2 pence from Edinburgh, day after day after day, in a fair clerk's hand, going back further than anybody in the house had bothered to look. And beside a certain number of entries, there was no charge at all, because a franked letter cost the receiver nothing. Hester took the postage book to a table by the window and did not speak for 4 hours. What she was doing was not complicated. It was only tedious, and tedium was a thing she had been trained in by a blind man who had needed every lease read twice. She went back through 2 years, and she wrote out, in her own hand, every entry that carried no charge, with its date and the name upon it. There were 96 of them. Most were exactly what they should have been. Peers writing to a peer. Members writing about committees. A bishop, but 41 of them were not. 41 franked letters had come into Ellingcourt House in 2 years from 11 men who, so far as anybody in the house could establish, had never written to the Duke of Ellingcourt about anything, before or since. Some of the names meant nothing to her at all. 2 were dead. She did not tell him what it meant, because she did not yet know. She made a list and ruled it, and headed the columns, and put it in the drawer. On the last day of February, Mr. Ignatius Vellacott called at Bryanston Square. Hester was in the room because Mrs. Merivale liked her to be in the room, and she stayed in it for the whole of the 15 minutes, standing at the side table with the tea things. And afterwards, she could not have quoted one sentence in which he had threatened her. He asked after Lady Atwood, who was at Brighton. He was sorry to have missed the bride. He spoke about the Bethnal Green Committee and about the coal, and about a new subscription for the widows of the men of the 45th, which he had put his own name to, and Mrs. Merivale was very much moved by this and said so twice. Then he said, "You are fortunate in Miss Loveday." "I am," said Mrs. Merivale comfortably. "Nobody knows it, of course," said Mr. Vellacott. "That is the melancholy part." He turned his cup a little in the saucer. "I have been going over the committee books this month, and it is quite remarkable. 4 years of minutes, and I do not think there is a page of them in your hand, ma'am. And yet, every one of them sounds like you. That is not a common accomplishment. A woman who can be somebody else on paper for 4 years without once slipping is a very unusual sort of woman indeed." He said it warmly. He was smiling. Mrs. Merivale laughed and said that Hester was a treasure, and that she did not know what she would do without her. And Hester, standing at the side table with the sugar tongs in her hand, understood 2 things at once, and neither of them was said aloud. The first was that Mr. Vellacott had just told Mrs. Merivale, in the pleasantest possible way, that the letters going out over her signature were not hers, that she had been putting her name to another woman's opinions for 4 years, and that other people had noticed. The second was that Mrs. Merivale had heard it and had laughed, and would begin thinking about it in about a week. He rose at 3:30. He shook Mrs. Merivale's hand. At the door he turned and said, Miss Loveday, do give my regards to the man in Holborn. Dunnage. Tell him Velicott sent you, if he ever gives you any trouble over the charges. I shall, said Hester. She did not sleep well that night, and she did not know why, which annoyed her more than the sleeplessness. On the 5th of March she went to Holborn. She went because the parcel of committee papers had to go, and because she had gone every Tuesday and Friday for 2 years and 1 month, and it was raining, and she was thinking about the postage book and the 41 entries, and not about anything else at all. Dunage's was a tobacconist that also did stationery, and also took in letters, which was an ordinary combination. It was 3 doors from the corner, low and dark, with a counter along the right side and a curtain at the back. She had been inside it perhaps 200 times. She could have described the smell of it in her sleep. She put the parcel on the counter. Mr. Dunnage entered it in his book as he always did, in a hand that was much better than his shop. And because she was early, and because the rain had not slackened, she asked him for a quire of writing paper, and stood while he went to fetch it, which is how she came to be looking at the shelf behind the counter for the first time in 2 years and 1 month. There was a small brass kettle on a spirit stand at the end of the shelf, with the flame turned low under it and a thread of steam coming off the spout. Beside it lay a knife with a thin curved blade, of the sort a surgeon might own, and no tobacconist ever would. Beside that, a flat board with 2 brass clips at the top and a strip of felt along the lower edge. And hanging on a nail above the board, 2 more squares of felt, both damp, one of them stained faintly brown at the corner. Hester Loveday stood with her hands on the counter and did not move. She knew exactly what she was looking at, because she had watched her father's employer do it once to open a packet whose owner had died, and her father had made her look at it and had said, "This is how it is done properly. And now you will know it if you ever see it done improperly. You bring the steam up under the seal, and you keep the wax warm and pliant, and you go in flat under the edge with a thin blade, and you lift the whole seal without cracking it. Then you read what is inside. Then you lay the sheet on the board and press it back with the damp felt, so the creases fall in the same places, and you set the seal down again while the wax is still soft, and there is no man alive who could tell you it had been touched. There was no tea in that shop. She had never once in 2 years seen Mr. Dunnage drink tea, and there was no cup, and there was no pot, and the kettle was small and shallow, and made to boil 3 inches of water fast. Mr. Dunnage came back with the paper. "4pence, Miss Loveday," he said. She paid him 4pence. She said something about the rain. She took her parcel of paper, and she said good day. And she walked out of the shop and turned left, which was the wrong way, and got some distance along Holborn before she understood that she had turned the wrong way, and by then she had stopped walking altogether. She sat down on the step of a shuttered shop front with her paper on her knees, and the rain coming off the eaves onto her shoulder. She had been looking in the wrong house. For 3 weeks she had gone over the postage book at Ellingcourt House, and had sat at that window making her lists, and had thought about Peel and Trant and Sebastian, because that was where the leak had to be, because those were the men who knew the Duke's movements. But nobody in Ellingcourt House had ever had to know anything at all. A letter is not private. A letter is a piece of paper that travels for 2 days through the hands of strangers, and the only moment it is truly out of anybody's care is the hour it lies in a receiving house, waiting for the collection. A man with a kettle and a knife in a quiet back room did not need a traitor in a great house. He needed nothing but time, twice a week for years, and the person who had carried Mrs. Augusta Merivale's correspondence into that back room twice a week, in all weathers, never late, never careless, never once failing to be exactly where she was expected to be, was Hester Loveday. The Bethnal Green letters, the committee minutes, 4 years of them, and beneath that, colder, arriving second, it had been Vellacott who put them there. He had said so himself at a wedding party, laughing at his own small vanity. He had recommended an honest man in Holborn who would do it for less, 2 years ago, or thereabouts. He had told her to her face, in front of a room, and she had thanked him for it. Hester sat on the step in the rain for a long time. What she felt was not fear, and it was not even anger, or not yet. What she felt was a kind of vertigo, the sort that comes from stepping onto a stair that is not there, because for 11 years she had been proud of exactly one thing, which was that she was reliable. Her reliability was the mechanism. Nothing else in the arrangement had been reliable at all. Mrs. Merivale forgot things. Servants left. Committees changed their meeting days. The only fixed point in the whole apparatus, the one part that never failed, the part you could build a machine around, had been her. She stood up eventually and shook out her skirts and walked back the way she had come. 2 days after that, they met at the General Post Office, and it was her suggestion. She had understood something on the step in Holborn that she could not have explained at the time, which was that she was tired of rooms. Every conversation she had ever had with the Duke of Ellingcourt had taken place in a room with one door, chosen for who could not enter it. That was necessary, and it was also, she found, humiliating in a way she had not previously permitted herself to notice. So she wrote and said, "Meet me at St. Martin's le Grand at 4, and he came. The great hall of the chief office, at 4 in the afternoon in March of 1840, was a thing she never afterwards forgot. It had been built for a country that wrote perhaps 76 million letters in a year, and in the 10 weeks since the 10th of January, that country had begun writing 200 million, and the building was drowning. The sorters worked at long tables with their sleeves rolled, and there were sacks on the floor between the tables because there was nowhere else to put them, and the noise was a low, continuous roar of paper and boots, and men calling out towns. By the window, a clerk was holding up one of the new pictorial covers, the ones with the allegorical design that the post office had issued in expectation of applause, and reading aloud a caricature of it from a newspaper. And 4 men were laughing at him. Somebody had drawn a face on another and pinned it to a post. Hester and Gervase Ashcombe stood against the wall on the eastern side and watched it, and nobody looked at either of them once. That was the point of it. And she thought he understood, because after a while he said, "Nobody here knows who I am. Nobody here has time," she said. "I find I like it a great deal. It is the only room in London where we may stand at the same distance from the wall," said Hester. "And it is because in here everybody is only as important as the sack in front of them." She told him about the shop then, standing in the noise, where nobody could overhear a word. He did not interrupt her. When she had finished, he was quiet for some seconds, watching the sorters. 2 years, he said. 2 years and 1 month. "That is not your fault." "I know whose fault it is," said Hester, "and it is not mine. And I have not spent 3 days telling myself otherwise. But it is my hands, your grace, and there is a difference." She looked at the tables. "He did not need a clever man inside your house. He needed a punctual woman outside it, and I was the most punctual thing in the arrangement." He did not offer her comfort, which she was grateful for afterwards. He said instead, "Then we have been looking in the wrong place for 3 weeks. And I am glad you found it in March and not in June." And then, watching a boy drag a sack past them, he said something that she thought about for a long time afterwards. "I spoke for this in August," he said. 9 minutes in the Lords and badly. I said it was a small good thing that would let a laborer hear from his son. He nodded at the roaring hall. "This is what I voted for, and I am glad of it. And it is also the thing that put a man in a hurry who was in no hurry before, and got Raxel's packet sent to me, and put you on a step in the rain. I do not know what to do with that. I am not accustomed to being the cause of something I meant well by." "You will grow accustomed to it," said Hester. "Everybody who does anything at all does." She made her mistake on the 12th of March, and she made it carefully, which was the worst part. The finding of the shop in Holborn had told her how the letters were being read. It had not told her how anybody knew where the blue case was, or where the Duke would be, or which passage he would take at a wedding. That still required a man in the house, and Hester had built her case for 8 days, and she had built it well. She laid it out in the study with her papers ruled and her columns headed, the way her father had taught her. 3 arguments. First, the postage book. From the summer of 1838, the entries changed their form. They had been kept in narrow columns, and they became broad ones. And the change fell within 4 weeks of the first of the 41 unexplained franked letters. The man who changed the ruling of that book was Barnaby Trant. Second, of the 3 men in the household, Trant was the one who received the Duke's traveling arrangements a fortnight in advance because he settled the bills at the inns. Third, Trant had been in Wiltshire in October of 1839. He had gone down on the 16th and stayed 12 days, which was the month of the forged cover, and it was the only time in 2 years that he had left London. She did not say the word traitor. She did not have to. She laid the 3 things beside one another and let them do it. The Duke sent for Trant that afternoon. Hester was in the room. She had asked to be, and she was glad of it afterwards in the way one is glad of a scar. Barnaby Trant listened to the whole of it standing up, holding his hat, with his head at that odd angle. He did not interrupt, and he did not deny anything, and when it was finished, he did not defend himself at all. He looked at Hester for a moment. "You read the book very well," he said. "You have never once read a man." Then he put his hat on in the house, which he had probably never done in 20 years, and went out. Sebastian Ashcombe came in an hour later with a letter in his hand and put it on the desk. "Trant has gone to a lodging in Southwark," he said. "His sister-in-law's. He has £3 and no character." "Sebastian," said the Duke, "he changed the ruling of the postage book in 1838 because he could no longer read a narrow column," said Sebastian Ashcombe. "He has been going blind for 6 years, and he has told nobody, and if you had ever once watched him hold a paper, you would have seen it in a week." He turned to Hester, and there was no pleasure in his face at all. "And he went to Wiltshire in October of 1839 to bury his wife. She is in the churchyard at Ellingcourt, 6 feet from my aunt. You may go down and read it on the stone." The room was quite silent. "I had the dates," said Hester. "You had the dates," said Sebastian. "Yes." He went out. She did not sleep at all that night, and in the morning she began again from nothing, and this time she did it the other way round. She stopped asking who had the opportunity and began asking who could be made to. A man does not betray a house he has served for 12 years because somebody offers him money. Men who take money take it early and take it often and are visible. A man who has served 12 years and has never been visible is not bought. He is held. And to hold a man you must have something of his, and it must be something he cannot replace and cannot go to law about. So she went looking for what each of the 3 men had that could be taken away. Sebastian Ashcombe had an expectation. He was heir presumptive, and if the Duke married and got a son, he would lose it. And this was so obvious and so public that no man on earth could have used it against him quietly. Barnaby Trant had his eyes and had already lost them, and had told nobody. Gideon Peel had a wife and 3 children in a house in Stepney and had married in 1836. And Hester could not for a week discover where. She went first to Somerset House, because since the 1st of July in 1837, the state had kept its own registers of every birth and death and marriage in England, and she had assumed, as everybody assumed, that this meant every marriage was written down somewhere in that building. She was there 2 days and found nothing at all. And on the second afternoon, a clerk explained to her with enormous patience that the registers began in July of 1837 and that a marriage in 1836 had never been the state's business and never would be, and that if she wanted a marriage of 1836, she must find the parish that performed it. So she found the parish. It took her 9 days and 11 churches, and the entry, when she found it, was in a clerk's hand in the register of a parish church in Stepney under October of 1836, and she read it 4 times in the vestry with the sexton waiting. Gideon Peel, bachelor of this parish, had married Susanna Carrick, spinster, and in the entry above it, in the same book, in April of 1834, Gideon Peel had married Mary Carrick, and between them, in the burials, in November of 1835, Mary Peel, aged 27, he had married his dead wife's sister. Hester sat down on the vestry bench. She knew what it meant because everybody in England who read a newspaper knew what it meant, and because it had been the great scandal of the drawing rooms 5 years earlier. Before 1835 such a marriage had stood, unless somebody troubled to challenge it in the church courts, and hardly anybody ever did. And there were thousands of them all over the country. Then Parliament had passed the Act, and from the 1st of September in 1835, every such marriage made thereafter was not merely voidable, but void. Void from the beginning, not a marriage at all, and never had been, which meant that Susanna Peel was not Gideon Peel's wife and never had been, which meant that the 3 children in the house in Stepney were, in the eye of the law, bastards. They could inherit nothing. They could take nothing under a will that named them as his children. If he died, they had no claim on anything he owned, and their mother had no claim on anything either, and the whole of it could be established in an afternoon by any man who held a copy of that entry. Hester paid the sexton 1 shilling and 6pence for a certified copy and walked out into the churchyard and stood there in the cold. She did not go to the Duke. She went to Peel. She found him in the small room off the study where he worked at 4 in the afternoon, and she shut the door behind her and said nothing at all. She simply put the copy of the entry on the desk in front of him, face up. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he did something she had not expected, and had been braced against, and was not prepared for. He got up and walked to the window, and stood with his back to her and his hands on the sill, and she saw them shaking. "Who else?" he said. "Nobody. He does not know you have that. Mr. Vellacott has had a copy of it since 1837, said Hester. "Has he not?" Peel made a sound that was not a word. "Since the march of it," he said. "He came to me himself. He was very civil. He was civil the whole time. He has never once in 3 years said a hard thing to me. He sat where you are standing, and he told me what the Act said, and he had it written out, and he asked me whether my little girl knew, and then he asked me whether I should like a glass of water." He turned round. Hester had prepared herself for a man who was relieved. She had read that somewhere, that a man carrying a thing too long is glad to set it down, and she had expected tears and gratitude, and a confession that ran downhill once it started. What she got was a man white with rage. "You come in here," he said. and you put that on my desk, and you look at me the way you have been looking at me for 3 weeks, as if I were a column that would not add." He came a step forward. "Do you know what I have given him? Dates, where he sleeps, what road he takes, which house in London holds a blue leather case that he has never once mentioned to me. 23 times in 3 years. And every single time I have gone home afterwards and sat in a room with 3 children who do not know that they are nothing, and eaten my dinner." "Mr. Peel, you asked me why I sold him," said Gideon Peel. "I will ask you a question, Miss Loveday, and I should be very glad of an answer, because I have not been able to find one in 3 years. What would you pay so that your children were not bastards?" Hester said nothing. "There is no answer," he said. "There is no figure. That is what the man understood before I did." He sat down again, heavily, and put his hands flat on the desk. She stayed where she was, and after a while she asked the only thing that mattered, which was not what he had done, but what it had been for. "What does he want?" she said. "Not the covers. He has had those for years, and he is in no hurry about those. What is he doing now, this month?" Peel looked up. "He has filed a petition in Chancery," he said, 3 weeks ago, "for the guardianship of Colonel Wraxall's daughter." Hester went very still. "The child," she said. "The child," said Peel. "And a will of the Colonel's, dated the 12th of December in 1837, appointing him guardian. It has 2 witnesses, and both hands are good, and both men are dead. One at Newport, one of the cholera in the summer. She was already working it, standing there in his little room with the light going. The date is before the 1st of January in 1838, she said." Peel nodded slowly, and she saw that he had understood this before she had, and had been living with it. "The new Act on Wills came in on the 1st of January in 1838, he said. "Everything after that must be signed at the foot, before 2 witnesses present at the same moment, and they must sign in his presence, and if you get 1 hair of it wrong, the whole instrument falls. Everything before that date is under the old law." He turned his hand over. "There is nothing to attack. There is no procedure to catch it on. And there is nobody left alive to ask." Hester said, "He does not need the money." "I beg your pardon. £30,000 in consols," she said. "It is a child's fortune. And the moment the court appoints a guardian, the stock is paid into court, and it sits there under the accountant general, and the guardian cannot touch a penny of it except by petition, for the child's maintenance, itemized." She looked at him. "He knows that better than any man in England. He was a parliamentary agent for 8 years. He has drawn more petitions than most solicitors have read." Peel was watching her now. "Then what?" said. "The papers," said Hester. She said it slowly, because it was arriving as she said it. "A guardian does not only get the child. He gets the care of everything that was the father's until she comes of age. The furniture, the plate, the boxes." She met his eyes. "Colonel Wraxall wrote 4 sheets in his own hand in a bed at Newport, describing a room above a stationer's shop in Bristol, and he sent a copy to the Duke of Ellingcourt." "Where is the original?" "In a locked chest," said Gideon Peel, "with the rest of the Colonel's papers. In the house at Blackheath, under seal, awaiting the appointment of a guardian." "He is not going after the fortune at all," said Hester. "He is going after the only piece of paper in England that names him." There was a silence in the little room. Then Peel said very quietly, "She is 8. I know. She has a nurse, Jepson. She has had her since she could walk." "I know," said Hester. "She got as far as the 24th of March. Mrs. Augusta Merivale sent for her after breakfast, into the small parlor where nothing was ever discussed, and Hester knew what it was before she had crossed the room, because Mrs. Merivale had had the fire made up at 9 in the morning, which she only ever did when she meant to sit still. She did not shout. That would have been easier. She said that she had been thinking. She said that Charlotte was newly married, and that a young wife's position is made in the first year and unmade in it too. She said that a name once spoken in a certain way is very difficult to get back. She said that Mr. Vellicott had called again on Friday, when Hester was out, and had been most kind, and had said nothing whatever against Miss Loveday, and had merely observed, in passing, that it was a pity when a respectable woman's name became attached to a great man's private affairs, because these things were never fair, and the woman always took the worst of it. "He said nothing against me," said Hester. "Not a word," said Mrs. Merivale. "He spoke very warmly of you." "Yes," said Hester, "he would." "You will understand," said Mrs. Merivale, "that I cannot give you a character." Hester had been expecting the dismissal for a week. She had not been expecting that. She stood in the middle of the parlor and felt the floor of the next 10 years go out from under her, quite quietly, without any noise at all. There was no work for a woman of her sort without a character. Not as a companion, not as a governess, not as a housekeeper, not anywhere. A character was the whole of it. A woman without one had either been dishonest or had been ruined, and the world did not much trouble itself to find out which, because the two were held to come to the same thing in the end. "I have been in this house 4 years," she said. "You have," said Mrs. Merivale, and she had the grace to look at the fire. "And if I write you a character, then I have written that I saw nothing, and if it should afterwards appear that there was something to see, then I am the woman who wrote it." She smoothed her skirt. "I am sorry, Hester. I am not a brave person. I have never pretended to be." "No," said Hester, "you have not." She packed 2 boxes. It did not take long, which she found she minded more than she expected. 4 years, and it came to 2 boxes and a bandbox, and one of the boxes was books, and half of those were her father's. She left at 4 in the afternoon by the area steps, because the front door had never been hers to use. Charlotte was at Brighton and would not be back until the 11th of April, and knew nothing about any of it, and would write in May to an address that no longer existed. Nobody came out to see her go. The housemaid was at the linen. The footman she trusted had been sent to Ludgate Hill on an errand at 3:30, which Hester thought about afterwards, and decided had probably been kindness of a sort, since he would have made a scene. She had £4 and 11 shillings. A hackney, to the sort of lodging she could now afford, would have cost 1 and 6pence. She walked. He offered her 4 things in the first week of April, and she refused all of them. He offered a house in Half Moon Street. He offered an annuity of £200 settled irrevocably, so that it could not be taken back by him or by anybody after him. He offered to write to a dozen women of his acquaintance, any one of whom would have given her a place on his word alone. And when she had refused those, he offered simply to pay for her lodging until the matter was over, on any terms she cared to name. They were sitting in his study. She had walked from Clerkenwell. "You are going to tell me that it would not be proper," he said. "I am going to tell you nothing of the sort," said Hester. "I do not care very much about proper, and neither, I think, do you. I am going to tell you that it would be stupid." He stopped. "Explain it to me." She put her hands flat on her knees. "At some point in the next 2 months," she said, "a court is going to be asked to decide whether a set of covers and a set of dates mean what I say they mean. And when that day comes, everything I have said will be worth exactly as much as I am worth, and not 1 shilling more. If I am a woman who lodges in Clerkenwell and copies documents for 1 and 3pence a folio, then I am a poor witness and a dull one and an inconvenient one, but I am nobody's." She looked at him. "If I am a woman living in a house you have taken for me, on an income you have settled on me, then I am not a witness at all. I am an item of your expenditure. Their counsel will not even trouble to attack me. He will simply read out the address and the figure and sit down, and the master will draw his own conclusions, and he will be right to. There was a long silence in the study. That had not occurred to me, said Gervase Ashcombe. No, said Hester, it would not. You have never in your life had to think about what your own maintenance would look like, read aloud. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, Is there anything at all that I may do that does not poison you? Yes, she said. You may write to me. The room in Clerkenwell was 18 shillings a month, and it was on the second floor at the back, and the window gave onto a drying yard, so that on Mondays and Thursdays she wrote in a gray light through other people's sheets. It had a bed, a table, a chair, a grate that drew badly, and a cupboard. She hung her father's shaving glass on the door because it was the only thing she owned that had been made to be looked into. For money she took in copying. There was a man named Mr. Spearin who kept a law stationer's in Chancery Lane, and who put out more work than his own writers could do, and who sent it out to be done in people's homes and paid by the folio of 72 words. It was 1 and 3 pence a folio, and a folio was 90 minutes of very careful work if the hand you were copying was bad, and she could do 6 in a long day and 8 if she did not stop. She did not go to the shop. That was not how it was done. A boy brought the work in a satchel on Mondays and took it away on Thursdays, and there was a receipt book, and she signed the receipt book with her initials, which was ordinary and which everybody did. Mr. Spearin of Chancery Lane never once, in 10 weeks, knew that the copyist of the Hallowell abstracts was a woman. Hester thought about that a good deal in the evenings, with her hand aching. For 4 years she had written another woman's letters, and everybody who read them had believed they were reading Mrs. Merivale. Now she wrote other men's deeds, and everybody who read them believed they were reading a clerk. She had spent her whole working life being an excellent hand attached to somebody else's name, and it had never before struck her as anything but a living. It struck her now. He wrote to her every day. That was the thing she had not anticipated when she asked for it. She had asked to be written to because it was the one form of assistance that could not be produced in a courtroom as a benefit received, and because she had wanted, without admitting it, to be written to. She had not thought about the price of it, because she had not needed to, because the price was 1 penny. In November, it would have been 8 pence a letter from St. James's Square to Clerkenwell, and it would have been paid by her, and she could not have afforded to be written to daily by anybody on earth. That was simply what the world had been. She had grown up in a house where a letter arriving was an event with a cost attached, and where her mother had once let a letter from her own sister go back, refused because there was no money in the house that week, and had said nothing about it for 3 days. Now a man could put a penny on a letter and write to her because he had thought of something. He wrote about what had gone wrong in the day. He wrote about a tenant at Ellingcourt who would not repair a wall, and about the 4th reading of a bill he could not get anybody to care about, and about the fact that Sebastian had begun coming to dinner and had not once been civil. He wrote once, at the end of a page, that he had gone down to the churchyard at Ellingcourt and had read a stone, and had stood there for some time and had not known what to do about it. She wrote back about the drying yard, and about the woman on the floor below who sang while she worked and did not know a single second verse, and about the Hallowell abstracts, and about a boy she saw every morning outside a chandler's shop who had learned to read from the sign. Neither of them ever wrote one word about affection. In the 2nd week, he wrote a line she cut out with her father's knife and kept in the lid of her workbox. "I am not accustomed to speaking," he wrote. "I am accustomed to writing. If you wish to know me, read." The will of Bartholomew Wraxall, dated the 12th of December in 1000, 837, came before the Prerogative Court of Canterbury at Doctors' Commons on the 9th of April. Hester went because it was open, and anybody might. Doctors' Commons was a set of buildings south of St. Paul's, around 2 courtyards, and it was the strangest place she had ever been inside. It smelled of paper and cold coal. The men who practiced there were not barristers and were not solicitors, and were called proctors and advocates, and they wore fur and scarlet. And the whole establishment had been going about its business in the same rooms since the 16th century, with the serene indifference of an institution that has outlived 4 dynasties. The will was proved without incident in about 12 minutes. Nobody appeared against it. Nobody had any grounds to. Afterwards, in the registry, Hester paid 1 shilling and 8 and asked for an office copy, which any member of the public might do, and which several people were doing at that moment. And she sat down at the end of a long table in the copying room to wait for it. And she noticed, sitting there, that nobody looked at her, and that she did not like it. That was new, and it was extremely unwelcome, and she turned it over for some minutes before she understood it. For 11 years, her invisibility had been a skill. She had built it, she had maintained it, she had been proud of it in the private way one is proud of a thing nobody can be told about. It had been a coat she put on. Here she was invisible because she was a woman in a plain gray dress in a room full of men in fur. And nobody looked at her, for the same reason nobody looks at a chair. It was the identical fact, and it was not the same thing at all. And she sat in the copying room at Doctors' Commons with her hands in her lap and understood, for the first time in her life, that she had always had the option of being seen and had simply declined it, and that she no longer had the option. Mr. Vellacott came through the room at 12:30 with 2 proctors and a clerk on his way out. He saw her, he stopped, and he took off his hat. "Miss Loveday," he said, "I had heard you were in London still. I am very glad to see you looking well." 6 men turned round. "Mr. Vellacott," said Hester, "I trust you have found something suitable," he said, with real warmth, and put his hat back on, and went out into the courtyard. It was beautifully done. He had not said one word that was not kind. He had established, in 9 seconds, in front of 6 practitioners of the court that was about to be asked to weigh her word, that she was a woman who had recently been out of a place. The office copy was delivered to her lodging on the 11th, and she found the thing on the 14th, and for 7 days she believed she had won. She had been copying it out. That was all. She had been copying it because copying a document is the only way to read it properly, because a hand that forms every letter cannot skim, and her father had taught her that when she was 15 years old, and she had never once found it wrong. She had come to the middle of the second sheet, and the light in the drying yard had gone, and she had lifted the paper towards the window to see a doubtful word, and the watermark came up in the glass. She looked at it for a moment without understanding what she was looking at. Then she stood up so quickly that the chair went over. Every sheet of writing paper made in England carried the maker's mark and the year of its manufacture. That was not a courtesy. It was the law, and it had been the law since the excise had wanted to know what it was taxing. And every stationer and every clerk and every solicitor's daughter in the kingdom knew it, and never thought about it, the way one never thinks about the numbering of the pages. The mark in the sheet said 1838. The will was dated the 12th of December in 1837. She sat down on the floor beside the fallen chair with the paper in both hands. A sheet of paper made in 1838 cannot be written upon in 1837. It is not a question of probability or of interpretation or of what a witness remembers. It is a question of whether the object existed. The paper had come into the world after the date written on its face, and therefore the date written on its face was a lie, and therefore the will was forged, and therefore everything Ignatius Vellacott had built for 3 years came down in the time it takes to hold a sheet up to a window. She was at St. James's Square at 8 the next morning. She had not gone to the Duke's house in daylight since March. She went now, and she was shown up, and she put the sheet in his hands and made him hold it to the glass himself, and she watched him find it. It was the first time in 5 weeks that she had seen Gervase Ashcombe laugh. The prerogative court sat on the 21st of April on the citation, and their proctor put the watermark before the court in a quarter of an hour, and it was the best quarter of an hour Hester had ever spent in a public room. Then Mr. Vellacott's advocate rose and called one witness. He was a heavy, comfortable man of about 60 in a good brown coat, and he gave his name as Josiah Bewick, and he said he was a paper maker of Maidstone in the county of Kent, and that his father had been a paper maker before him, and that he had been in the trade 44 years. He was asked about the watermark and the year, and he explained it, patiently, at some length, in the way of a man explaining his own trade to people who have never been inside a mill, and Hester sat in the third row and felt the floor tilt. The year in the paper was put there by a wire device on the roll, he said, and the roll had to be made up by hand. And no mill in England changed its rolls on the 1st of January, because no mill in England was so foolish as to make paper on the 31st of December that it could not sell in 12 months. The rolls went on in the summer. His own house changed in July, and had done for as long as he could remember, and the Hertfordshire mills went in August, and 1 or 2 went as early as the end of June. The trade had done it that way for 40 years, and every stationer in London knew it. And if a gentleman wanted paper marked 1838 in the autumn of 1837, he could walk into any shop on Fleet Street and buy a ream of it over the counter. Their proctor asked 2 questions in reply, and got nowhere because there was nowhere to get. The advocate for Mr. Vellacott then asked, with great courtesy, from what source the objection had originally come. And their proctor, who was an honest man and had no choice, said that the observation had been made by a copyist. Might we have the name of the copyist? Miss Hester Loveday. Not a stationer, said the advocate. Not a paper maker. Not any person of the trade. No. The advocate sat down, and it went into the register, and Hester Loveday walked out of Doctors' Commons at 4 in the afternoon and got as far as the archway before she had to stand still for a while. She had not been careless. That was the part she could not put down. She had been right about the fact and wrong about the world, and the difference between those 2 things was 44 years in a mill in Maidstone, and there had been no possible way for her to know it, and every possible way for her to have asked. She had held a sheet up to a window, and she had been so pleased with herself that she had not stopped for 2 days to ask a single man in the trade whether the thing she had found meant what she thought it meant. Her father would have asked. He would have made her walk to the stationer on the corner and ask, and he would have made her do it before she said a word to anybody, and he had told her so 100 times, and he had been dead 4 years, and she had forgotten. She began again on the 22nd, and she began by doing the thing she should have done in February, which was to stop looking at the enemy's papers and look at her own. She asked the Duke's solicitor for the will of Colonel Wraxall dated the 3rd of March in 1839, the one that named Gervase Ashcombe as guardian, and she asked for the original and not a copy, and she took it back to Clerkenwell and copied it out. It was a short instrument, 2 sheets. The colonel had written it himself, which was common enough in a serving officer, and it was signed at the foot, and beneath the signature stood the attestation clause and two names: Barnaby Trant, Josiah Cobb, his mark being a signature in a slow round hand. She copied it twice, and on the second copy she stopped. The ink of the two witnesses was not the same. It was the same ink. She was certain of that within a minute. The same blue-black from the same bottle, and there was no difficulty there at all. But Trant's signature had sunk into the paper the way ink sinks when the pen is loaded and the stroke is unhurried, and it had feathered very slightly along the grain in two places, and Cobb's had not. Cobb's sat higher on the surface. Cobb's had the faint gray scratch of a nib coming to the end of what it was carrying, which meant that the pen had been used a good deal between the one signature and the other, or that time had passed, or both. It might have meant nothing. A man goes to the door. A man is called away and comes back. She wrote it in her book, and she went to Blackheath. The house at Blackheath was shut up and under seal, but the servants had not all gone, and the coachman's wife was still in the rooms over the stable, and Josiah Cobb was a groom of 30 who had been with the colonel 9 years and was now with nobody at all, and was very glad to talk to somebody about him. She did not tell him what she was asking. She asked him to tell her about the day. He told her about the day. The colonel had come down at 11 and had written for an hour in the morning room, and Mr. Trant had been there because Mr. Trant had come about the Wiltshire tenancy, and at about noon the colonel had called Mr. Trant over and had signed his name, and Mr. Trant had signed under it. And then the colonel had said he was tired and had gone up. And then, said Cobb, Mr. Trant had come out to the kitchen a good while after, 20 minutes, it might have been more, and had said the colonel wanted his name on a paper, and he had wiped his hands and gone in and put his name where he was shown. Where was the colonel? Said Hester. Upstairs, said Cobb. He was resting. He was not well that spring, miss. Did you see him? Not till the evening, said Cobb. Hester walked from Blackheath to Clerkenwell because she did not have the coach fare, and it took her 3 hours and 20 minutes, and she did not notice any of it. The Wills Act had come into force on the 1st of January in 1838. It said that a will must be signed at the foot by the testator, in the presence of 2 witnesses present at the same time, and that those witnesses must then subscribe the will in the presence of the testator, not afterwards, not in another room, not in the kitchen 20 minutes later, with the testator asleep upstairs. They had made it strict on purpose. That was the whole point of the act. Parliament had looked at a century of forged and doubtful and half-attested instruments and had said, from this day forward there will be one rule, and it will admit of no argument, and if you do not keep it, your will is not a will at all. The will of the 3rd of March in 1839 was void, entirely, not partly, not doubtfully. It had never been a will, and no court in England could make it one, and Gervase Ashcombe had no more standing under it than the man who had carried the paper upstairs, which meant that the only surviving testamentary instrument of Bartholomew Wraxall, deceased, was the one dated the 12th of December in 1837, which was under the old law and needed nothing but 2 witnesses and their attestation, and had them, and both of them were dead. And it named Ignatius Vellacott. She stopped at the top of Clerkenwell Green and stood with her hand on a railing. The act had been passed to stop exactly the thing Vellacott had done. It had been drawn by careful men who had wanted to make forgery difficult. And what it had actually accomplished, in this one instance, was to destroy the honest will and leave the forged one standing, because the forged one had been dated into the years before the Reform, where the law was old and loose and did not ask very much. He had not chosen 1,837 to make the document plausible. He had chosen it to put the document outside the reach of the only act that could have caught it. She told him the next morning, and it was the worst hour of the whole business. He heard her out, standing by the window with his back to her, and he did not interrupt once. And when she had finished, he asked 2 questions, both of them exact, and she answered them. Then he said, "So the man I dismissed in March on your evidence is the only living person who can speak to what happened in that room?" "Yes, and he will not come." "I do not know," said Hester. "I have not asked him." He was silent for a long time. She had seen him take bad news before. She had seen him take the news that his own name stood on a forged cover, and he had gone still, and it had frightened her. This was different. She watched the whole of it go through him. She watched him arrive at the fact that 10 weeks of work had produced a worse position than the one he had started from, and that the reason it had was standing in his study. And she watched him decline to say so. That was the moment, she thought afterwards, when she stopped being able to think of him as an arrangement. "I should like to be alone," he said. She got as far as the door. "Miss Loveday." She turned. "I do not blame you," he said, and she could hear that he had chosen every word of it. "I am aware that I am about to be very poor company for some hours, and I would rather you were not obliged to sit through it." Then he turned back to the window, and she went out, and nobody came into the hall to see her to the door, because the footman was at the back, and Peel had not come in that day, and she let herself out of Ellingcourt House and walked home. She did not weep about it. She sat down at the table in the room in Clerkenwell at 7 in the evening with the Halliwell abstracts and a fresh-cut quill, and she copied 27 folios, and finished at 3 in the morning, because it was the only thing her hands still knew how to do without her. The Master in Chancery sat in his chambers in Southampton Buildings on the 5th of May at 11 in the morning to inquire into the petition of Ignatius Vellacott, Esquire, touching the person and estate of Adela Wraxall, an infant. It was not a courtroom, and there was no jury, and nobody wore a wig. It was a long room with a coal fire, 3 windows onto the buildings opposite, a turkey carpet, and a table with 9 men round it. That was how the Court of Chancery did its work. The Master read the papers, and asked what he wished to ask, and made his report, and the whole future of a child was settled between breakfast and dinner in a room that smelled of ink and wet wool. Hester Loveday had an affidavit in the papers. She had written it out herself 3 times, and sworn it before a Master Extraordinary in a room off Chancery Lane on the 2nd of May, and it ran to 9 pages in her own hand, because that was how it was done, and because she could not have afforded to have it engrossed. It set out the cover in the blue case. It set out the frank in the corner, reading Marlborough, and the receiving stamp on the reverse reading devises, and the 12 miles between them, and the rule that had governed franking for a century. It set out the 41 unexplained free letters in the postage book at Ellingcourt House. It set out, with dates, her attendance at the receiving house in Holborn, and what stood on the shelf behind Mr. Dunnage's counter, and what such a kettle and such a blade and such a board are used for. It did not accuse Mr. Vellacott of forging a will. It could not. It said only that there existed a manufactory of false francs, and that a man who wished to know what was in other people's letters had been taking their letters in at Holborn for 2 years, and that both of those facts touched the character of the person now applying for the care of an 8-year-old girl and £30,000. The Master examined her upon it for 40 minutes. He was a dry small man of about 70 named Mr. Coppleston, and he had been a master for 19 years, and he was not unkind. He took her through it in order. He asked about the 2 stamps. He asked her how she came to know the franking rule, and she said her father had been a solicitor's clerk, and she had read for him for 11 years, and he wrote it down. He asked her about the kettle, and she described what she had seen. And he asked her whether she had seen any letter opened, and she said that she had not. He asked her whether she was in the employment of the Duke of Ellingcourt. "No," said Hester. "Have you at any time received money from His Grace, or from any person on his behalf?" "Not 1 penny, sir." "Where do you reside?" "In lodgings in Clerkenwell, sir, at 18 shillings a month." "And your occupation?" "I take in copying," said Hester, "for a law stationer in Chancery Lane. 1 and 3 the folio." Mr. Coppleston wrote that down too, and looked at her for a moment over his spectacles, and she could not tell what he thought, and never afterwards found out. Mr. Vellacott's counsel rose at 10 minutes to 12. He did not challenge the affidavit. That was the thing she had not prepared for. She had spent 4 nights going over every sentence of those pages, waiting to defend them, and he did not touch 1 word. He said that his client had no observation to make upon Miss Loveday's account of the postal regulations, which he was sure was accurate, and no observation to make upon what Miss Loveday believed she had seen upon a shelf in Holborn. He said that he wished only to put 1 document before the master, which had come into his client's hands in the ordinary course, and which he had not intended to produce unless the deponent was examined. Then he laid a letter on the table. It went round the table from hand to hand. It came to Mr. Coppleston, who read it twice. Then it was passed to their side, and their counsel read it and went white about the mouth, and then it was handed across to Hester. It was a single sheet. It was dated the 8th of February in 1840. It was addressed to Ignatius Vellacott, Esquire, at his house in Duke Street. It said that the writer had been engaged since December by the Duke of Ellingcourt to construct an appearance of irregularity in certain postal covers. It said that the writer had been paid, and named a figure, and that the writer had come to be very much afraid of the position she was in and did not know where else to turn. It said that she had heard Mr. Vellacott spoken of as a just man. It asked for his protection. It was signed Hester Loveday, and it was in her writing. She sat in the chair at the end of the table in the master's chambers in Southampton Buildings and looked at her own hand on a piece of paper she had never touched in her life. It was not an imitation. That was the thing. She had spent 11 years looking at hands, and she knew what an imitation looked like, and this was not that. The H was hers, with the second stroke coming down through the crossbar the way she had made it since she was 12. The 8s were hers, made in one movement from the bottom, which was her father's way, and which she had never seen anybody else do. The little dragged underline she put beneath the last word of a paragraph without meaning to was there, and it was in the right place, and it had the right small hook at the end of it. She had never in her life written those words. "Miss Loveday," said Mr. Coppleston. "I did not write this," said Hester. "Did you not?" "No, sir." "Is that your hand?" She looked at it. She could have said no. She understood that perfectly clearly, sitting there. She could have said no. And it would have been a lie, and it might have carried, because the whole room had already seen that she was frightened, and frightened people are believed when they deny things. "It has every appearance of being my hand," she said. "Can you show me anything in it that is not?" "Not at this moment, sir." "Have you any witness?" said Mr. Coppleston, "or any document, or any circumstance, that would enable you to satisfy me that you did not write this letter?" And there it was. She sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and looked for it, and it was not there. She could not prove where she had been on the 8th of February, because on the 8th of February she had been in a house in Bryanston Square, doing 40 small things in 40 rooms, and no one of them would have taken her a whole day. She could not produce Mrs. Merivale, who had turned her out and would not now say good morning to her in the street. She could not produce specimens of her writing to set beside it, because every specimen of her writing in the world was either in the possession of Mrs. Augusta Merivale, who would not lend so much as a laundry list, or in the files of a law stationer in Chancery Lane, signed with 2 initials. A man who is accused of a forgery may prove that he did not make it. There is no way on earth for a person to prove that she did not write a thing that is written in her own hand. "I cannot, sir," said Hester. Mr. Coppleston took off his spectacles. He made his report that afternoon. It was not long. He found that the will of the 12th of December in 1837 was duly executed according to the law then in force, and that the instrument of the 3rd of March in 1839, being executed after the commencement of the Wills Act, was not duly attested and was void. He found that the paternal appointment of a guardian therefore stood in favor of Mr. Ignatius Vellacott, and he found that the affidavit of Hester Loveday was of such a character, having regard to the document produced, that no part of it could safely be relied upon, and directed that it be taken off the file. Adela Wraxall was brought up from Blackheath at 3 o'clock on the 7th of May, and taken away in a carriage from the yard behind Southampton Buildings. Hester was in the yard. She had no business there, and no standing to be there, and she went and stood at the wall by the gate with her hands folded, because it seemed to her that somebody ought to be in the yard who was on the child's side and was not being paid to be. The child was small for 8, in a black frock that had been made for her since November, and was already short at the wrist. She had her father's coloring. She came out holding the hand of a stout gray woman of about 60 in a bonnet, and at the carriage step the woman stopped and knelt down and said something, and the child put both arms round her neck. A clerk said something to the woman. She stood up and let go of the child's hand. The child got into the carriage. The door was shut. The carriage went out under the arch into Chancery Lane and turned north, and the gray woman stood in the middle of the yard by herself. Hester went over to her. "Mrs. Jeffson," she said. The woman looked at her without recognition. "They have told me I am not required," she said. "I have had her since she could walk. I had her mother before her." She looked at the archway. "They have told me I am not required, and I am to have my things out by 6. Hester said, "Where will you go?" And Mrs. Jeffson said, in the reasonable, entirely emptied voice of a woman who has not yet understood what has happened to her, "I do not know. I have not had to think of it before. The newspapers had it on the 9th. It was 4 lines in one of them, and rather more in another, and it named her in full, because there was no reason not to, and because Hester Loveday of Clerkenwell had no friends at any paper in London, and nobody had ever heard of her before, and she was therefore free. A former companion, dismissed without a character, was stated before a master in Chancery to have manufactured postal evidence at the direction of a nobleman. That was the shape of it. Nothing in it was actionable. Every word of it was a fair report of what had occurred in a public inquiry. On the 11th, Mr. Spearin's boy came on his usual round and took away the finished abstracts and did not leave any new work, and said, on the step, not unkindly, that Mr. Spearin was very sorry, but he had had a word from one of the offices, and he could not be sending out to that address any more. On the 14th, in the House of Lords, Gervase Ashcombe went into a division and found the bench on either side of him standing empty, which had not happened to him in 14 years, and which he did not mention to her in any letter. She heard about it later from Sebastian, who thought she ought to know. Mrs. Jeffson came to Clerkenwell on the evening of the 7th with a corded box and stood in the street, looking up at the windows, because she had nowhere at all to be, and Hester had written down the address in the yard on the back of a receipt. The room was 18 shillings a month and had one bed and one chair and one grate that drew badly, and Hester had £4 and 2 shillings in the world and no work. She took her in. There was no calculation in it, and she was not conscious of any particular kindness. She had simply looked at a woman of 60 standing in the road with a box, and it had been perfectly plain that there was nothing else to be done, and she had gone down and taken one handle of the box. They put a straw mattress on the floor by the grate, and Mrs. Jeffson slept on it for 6 weeks. He came to Clerkenwell on the 16th of May, in the afternoon, on foot. He brought no solicitor and no money and no proposal of any kind. Mrs. Jeffson took one look at him and put on her bonnet and said she would go and see about the bread, which was a thing she had never once said before and would not have known where to do. The room was 18 shillings a month, and there was one chair. He did not take it. He stood by the window with his hat in his hand and the drying yard behind him, and said the thing he had walked 2 miles to say. "I sent you out of a room," he said, "on the 24th of April. You had brought me the truth about that will, which nobody else in England had found, and which I needed, and I heard it. And I sent you out of the room so that I could be wretched in private." He turned the hat once. "That was 8 years of habit, and none of it was your business, and I have thought about it every day since, and I am sorry." "There is a thing I have wanted to ask you since February," said Hester. "Ask it. When you let go of me in that passage, you stepped back exactly so far and no further." She held up one hand with 2 fingers a little apart. "That much. I have turned it over a great many times, and I have never once been able to make it mean anything." Gervase Ashcombe looked at her hand and then at the floor. "The case was between us," he said. "If I had stepped back properly, it would have come away from your chest and stood out from you, and anybody at the turn of that passage would have seen a woman holding a flat blue box." He set his hat down on the table. Sleeth had not gone. I could still hear him on the stone, so I stood as near to you as I could stand and still be able to say afterwards that I had let go. Hester was quiet for a moment. "You were still hiding it," she said. "Even then, I was still hiding it," he said. "That is the thing I should like you to have straight before you decide anything else about me. In the whole of that corridor, there was one object I was thinking about, and it was not you." "That is not why you came," said Hester. "No," he said. "It is why I should have come 3 weeks ago. I have come today because there is something I ought to have told you in February and did not, and I did not tell you because I could not think how to say it without sounding like a man arranging an advantage." She waited. "In the summer of 1837, he said, "I began a correspondence with Mrs. Augusta Merivale about a soup kitchen in Bethnal Green." Hester's hands went still in her lap. "I had put money into it, and I wanted to know where the money went, and I wrote what I expected would be 1 letter. What came back was not what I expected. It was 3 pages, and it went through the coal contract line by line, and it told me that I had been overcharged by a whopping merchant for 14 months, and by exactly how much, and it ended by observing, quite civilly, that a gentleman who subscribes to a charity without reading its accounts should not be surprised to find that he has been feeding a coal merchant." He looked at the floor. "I have that letter. It is in the box marked 1837 on the second shelf. I have every letter that came out of that house. 73 of them," said Hester. 73, he said, "in 3 years. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Below in the yard a woman was singing the first verse of something."
"I argued with that mind for 3 years," said Gervase Ashcombe.
"It was the only correspondence in my life that I answered on the day it arrived. It was wrong about me twice and right about me 9 times, and it never once flattered me. And I came to think of Mrs. Merivale as the cleverest woman in London, and I said so, in company, more than once. And I imagine that a good many people who knew her thought I had lost my judgment. He put the hat down on the table. And in November, I wanted somewhere to put a case where nobody would think to look for it. And I wrote to that house, because I trusted the mind at the end of that correspondence with a thing I could not trust to my own bank. Then in February you got a card back, said Hester. Then in February I got a card back, he said, from a woman in a corridor, telling me which room in her employer's house had one door and no occupied chamber above it. And I read it, and I sat down in the middle of the morning, which is not a thing I do. He looked up at her. I kissed you before I knew your name, he said. But I had been reading your hand for 3 years. Hester Loveday sat in the one chair in a room in Clerkenwell with a splendid future and £4, 2 shillings and no work, and looked at the man standing against her window. Say the rest of it, she said. There is no rest of it, he said. There is nothing after that sentence that I have any right to say to a woman I have already cost her place, her character, and her trade. I am telling you because it is true and because you asked me in February to tell you things first. Then I shall tell you something, said Hester, and stood up. You have just handed me the only weapon I have had since the 5th of May, and I do not think you know it. They spread them on the long table in the study at Ellingcourt House the following morning, and it took the 3 of them until 2 o'clock to lay them out in order. 73 letters, 3 years, everyone dated, everyone carrying the receiving stamp of the chief office or the twopenny post, everyone entered in the index in his own hand with the day it came in and the day he answered it. A forger of a hand needs a specimen. 1 specimen or 2 is enough to make a letter that will satisfy a master in Chancery who has never seen the hand before. Nobody in England had ever been able to make it satisfy a man who had 73 specimens spread over 36 months, indexed, dated, and independently stamped by the post office. And there was the second thing. Hester took a sheet out of the middle of 1,838 and put it beside the copy of the forged letter that their counsel had obtained from the file. Look at the downstrokes, she said. Sebastian Ashcombe had come in at noon with a watchmaker's glass in his waistcoat pocket, which he had brought without being asked, and he had said nothing to her about anything, and he now bent over the table. A quill is a soft instrument, said Hester. It is split, and the split opens under pressure. When you come down the page, the nib spreads, and the stroke is broad, and when you come up it closes, and the stroke is thin. And you cannot help it, and you cannot prevent it. And when you turn a corner sharply, the 2 halves of the split do not close at the same instant, and you get a very small, ragged place at the turn. She put her finger beside a letter G. There and there. That is a bad quill, and it is mine, and I cut it myself. She moved her hand to the forgery. That is steel, she said. It is a Birmingham nib, and probably a good one. Look at the upstroke and the downstroke. They are the same weight. There is no spread. There is no ragged turn anywhere on that sheet. And there is no little blot at the head of a stroke where a quill puts down more than it means to. Because a steel nib does not do that. She straightened. I have never in my life written with a steel pen. My father taught me to cut a quill in 1,825 because he had gone blind and could no longer cut his own, and I have cut my own ever since. And there are 73 letters on this table across 3 years that will prove I have never used anything else. Sebastian Ashcombe looked at the 2 sheets under the glass for a long time. He is very good, he said at last. He has your letters. He has your slope, and that peculiar 8, and the underlining. He had my words, said Hester. He had 2 years of my words out of a shop in Holborn, and he could copy every one of them. He could not copy my pen because it never occurred to him that anybody in 1840 still cut one. Sebastian put the glass down. May I say something disagreeable, he said. You have said several. If Gervase marries and gets a son, said Sebastian Ashcombe, I go from being the heir presumptive of a dukedom to being a man with 900 a year and a good coat. That is the plain arithmetic, and I would rather say it out loud than have you wonder about it. He nodded at the table. I have spent 3 hours this morning helping you build the thing that is most likely to bring that about. Why? Said Hester. Because a fortnight ago I went to look at Ignatius Vellacott in the lobby of the house, said Sebastian, and I stood and watched him for 20 minutes being kind to people. And it came to me that if he wins this, then every title in England is held on his terms, and mine would be too. He picked up his hat. I would rather lose it than take it out of that man's hand. She went to Southwark on the 18th, and it rained the whole way. The lodging was over a cooper's on the north side of Union Street, and the sister-in-law who opened the door said Mr. Trant was not receiving, and Hester said she would wait, and stood in the street. She stood there 10 minutes by the church clock. The rain came off the eaves onto her left shoulder. 2 women went past and looked at her and did not stop. Then the door opened again. Barnaby Trant stood in it with his coat on over his shirt and his head at that angle, and he did not ask her in. I have come to say that I was wrong, said Hester, and that I have no excuse for it. I had 3 facts, and I made a man out of them, and I did it in front of your employer of 12 years, and you lost your place and your character, and I do not know how you have eaten since March. I am not going to explain to you how it happened, because you were there, and because an explanation is only a man asking to be thought well of. Trant said nothing. That is all, said Hester. I did not come for anything else, and I am not going to ask you for anything. Yes, you are, said Trant. She stopped. You have that look, he said. Everybody who has ever come up those stairs has had it. He wiped the rain off his face with the flat of his hand. Ask. On the 3rd of March last year, said Hester, you witnessed a will at Blackheath. I did. Josiah Cobb signed it 20 minutes after you did, in the kitchen, with the colonel asleep upstairs. He did, said Barnaby Trant. Did you know that was wrong? He looked at her for a moment with those bad eyes. I have been managing estates for 30 years, he said. There has not been a week since the act came in that I have not had to tell somebody that his father's will is waste paper. I knew it before the ink was dry. I said so. Who did you say it to? To Peel, said Trant, in writing the next morning. Hester stood very still in the rain. Have you a copy, she said. Barnaby Trant made a sound that might have been a laugh in a better week. I have kept a letter book for 30 years, he said. Every sheet I have ever sent out of any house I have worked in, pressed off wet and bound up by the year. It is the only thing I brought out of St. James's Square, because it is mine and not his. He turned round into the dark of the passage. Wait there. He came back with a heavy quarto bound in half-calf and put it into her hands on the doorstep in the rain. 4th of March, 1839, he said. It is the 3rd impression on the page. You will have to hold it to the light. The press was cold that morning. She held it up under the eaves and read it backwards through the tissue, in the reversed gray ghost of his own handwriting, dated in the margin. Mr. Peel, the will of yesterday is not well executed. The groom did not sign in the colonel's presence, and the colonel did not see him sign. Under the Act of 1837, the instrument is void and must be made again while the colonel is able. I press this upon you as a matter of some urgency. Peel knew, said Hester. Peel knew on the 4th of March last year, said Trant, and did nothing. And I wrote again in April, and he did nothing, And in the end I let it alone because it was not my business, and he was the colonel's man of affairs, and I was not. She looked up. Mr. Trent, she said, I shall have to produce this in Chancery. Then produce it. You will be asked why you kept it. Because I keep everything, said Barnaby Trant. Because I have poor sight and a good memory for nothing at all, and a man in my possession who does not keep a letter book is a man waiting to be hanged with his own words. He took hold of the door. Now go home. You are wet through. Mr. Trant, I have given you the book, he said. Do not ask me for anything else this year. And he shut the door. She went to Gideon Peel alone on the 20th, and she did not tell anybody she was going. He had a small house in a terrace in Stepney with a scraped step, and the girl who let her in was perhaps 6 and had ink on her fingers, and Hester had to sit for a moment in the parlor before she could speak. Peel came in and shut the door and stood. Hester took out of her bag the certified copy of the entry in the parish register, dated October of 1836, for which she had paid 1 shilling and 6pence in March, and laid it on the table between them. Peel looked at it. Then Hester picked it up again and turned to the fire and put it in. He came forward a step and stopped. They both watched it take. It curled, and went brown, and went up, and there was nothing left of it but a black flake that lifted on the draught and went to pieces against the back of the grate. Why, said Peel. Because he bought you with that, said Hester, and if I use it, I have paid you in his coin. And then there is no difference between us, and there never was. Peel sat down slowly on the edge of a chair. I want the truth about the 3rd of March 1839, said Hester, and I want it sworn. And I am going to tell you now what I have, so that you cannot say afterwards that I trapped you. I have Barnaby Trant's letter book. I have his warning to you of the 4th of March, and I have you doing nothing about it for a year. I do not need you to prove that the second will is void, because it is void on its face, and any master in England can see it. Then what do you want? I want you to say who you told, said Hester. Because the second will being void is worth nothing to Ignatius Vellacott unless he knows it is void, and unless he knows it before he files. She leaned forward. He filed in Chancery in the 1st week of March this year. He came out of nowhere with a will nobody had ever heard of, and he did it at the precise moment when the only competing instrument was waste paper. Somebody told him the ground was clear. Peel put his face in his hands. November, he said. The week after the colonel died, he sent to me and asked what the position was, and I said there was a later will in Ellincourt's favor. And he asked me, was it good? And you told him. I told him it was not worth the paper, said Gideon Peel, and I have not slept properly since. There was a silence in the little parlor. In the passage, the child with the inky fingers was telling somebody something at length. They will ask you in Chancery why you did it, said Hester, and you will have to answer. I know what they will ask me. Then think now about what you will say, because if you say nothing, they will assume money, and it will be in the papers, and your children will read it in 11 years. Peel looked up at her. You burnt it, he said. Yes. Then I will say the whole of it, he said, including that. She swore his affidavit on the 22nd, and she took it away, and on the 3rd, she began building the trap. It was quite simple in the end, which is what she had learned about all of it. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Godsolve, the housekeeper at Ellincourt House, in her own hand, about the airing of rooms and the price of candles. It was 4 pages long, and 39 of the 40 things in it were true. The one thing that was not true came in the 2nd paragraph, where she remarked, in passing, that His Grace had asked her to say that the Colonel's original statement of October last, the 4 sheets in his own hand, was not in London at all, and had never been in London, but was in the muniment room at Ellingcourt Abbey with the older deeds, and was to stay there until the Michaelmas audit. There was no muniment room at Ellingcourt Abbey. There never had been. The deeds were kept in an iron chest in the State Office, and had been since 1794, and any of the 40 people who had worked in that house in the last 50 years could have said so. She put it in at Duchess in Holborn on the 23rd of May. She had gone on paying Mr. Dunnage twice a week since March, because anybody may pay a receiving house to take in their letters, and there is no law that says a person must stop, and because a woman who suddenly stops using a shop after 2 years tells that shop something. She had continued to be exactly what she had always been: punctual, dull, and reliable. She was aware, putting it on the counter, that this was the first time in her life she had used her own reliability as a tool rather than been used by it. On the 27th, a document came into the hands of Mr. Vellacott's solicitors and was served with the papers for the rehearing. It purported to be a schedule of the Ellingcourt muniments, unsigned, in an estate clerk's hand, and it was very well done indeed. It referred twice to the muniment room at Ellingcourt Abbey. Elias Sleeth took the night coach for Devizes on the 28th. But Elias Sleeth was a careful man, and he had been a sergeant for 16 years, and before he went into Wiltshire, he came to Clerkenwell. He came at 11 at night on the 28th of May, up the stairs, in stockinged feet, which was a mistake, because Hester had been listening for iron on the stairs for 3 months and heard silence instead, and was already out of bed. He came in without knocking. He was a heavy man, and he filled the doorway, and he did not say anything at all, which was the frightening part. He went straight past her to the table, where a quarto letter book and a bundle of papers lay under the candle. Hester Loveday was 29 years old and weighed rather less than 8 stone and had no weapon in the room but a penknife for cutting quills. She did not reach for it. She opened her mouth and she screamed as loudly and as continuously as she had ever done anything in her life. And Mrs. Jepson, who had slept on a straw mattress by that grate for 3 weeks and had been a nurse for 40 years and had the reflexes of a woman used to being woken by a child, came up off the floor and screamed with her. And Mrs. Buckle, the landlady, who slept directly beneath and who had a lodging house and a license and a horror of anything happening on her stairs, came out onto her own landing and screamed at the two of them to know what in God's name was the matter, and then, understanding, put her head out of the street door and screamed for the whole of Rosamond Street. There were 40 people living in that terrace. 9 of them had windows on the street. 6 of those windows went up. Whatever Elias Sleeth had come to Clerkenwell to do, it required quiet, and he had lost the quiet inside 9 seconds. He caught Hester by the right wrist as she came at the table and turned it backwards and outwards the way a man turns a wrist when he wants somebody to stop and does not much care what happens after, and she heard it before she felt it. Then he took the papers off the table and went down the stairs and out past Mrs. Buckle, who described his coat to a constable within the half hour. He got what was on the table. What was on the table was Barnaby Trant's letter book and a bundle of copies, because Hester Loveday had been a copyist for 10 weeks and had a copyist's habits, and had spent the whole of the 27th at a desk, making a fair duplicate of every material page, and had deposited the originals with their solicitor at 9 o'clock that morning against a receipt. Elias Sleeth was taken at an inn outside Devizes on the 31st of May by the county constabulary on information laid from London, and there were found upon him a quarto letter book, a bundle of copies in a woman's hand, and a memorandum in the hand of a dead secretary referring to a room in a house in Wiltshire, which the constable, being a local man whose father had worked on that estate, was able to state on the spot did not exist and never had. Hester's wrist was set on the 29th by a surgeon in Rosamond Street and splinted from the knuckles to halfway up the forearm, and she was told she might use it in 6 weeks and should not expect it to be as it had been. It was the right hand. The rehearing came on before Mr. Coppleston in Southampton Buildings on the 11th of June. She could not write. She had tried on the 2nd and on the 4th and on the 7th, and the 3rd time she had cried about it, alone, with the door shut, for about 4 minutes, and then had washed her face and got on. So on the 8th of June, the Duke of Ellingcourt came to Clerkenwell with a traveling desk and a quire of paper, and sat down at the table in the one chair, and took off his coat, and said, "Begin when you are ready and go as slowly as you like." And Hester Loveday walked up and down a room, 18 shillings a month, and dictated her affidavit, 9 pages of it, over 5 hours, and a man wrote it down. She stopped once, about the middle of the 3rd page, and he looked up and asked whether she wanted to rest. "No," she said. "It is only that I have done this before, from the other side." He waited. "For 11 years I sat where you are sitting," said Hester, "and my father walked where I am walking, and every lease, and every letter, and every opinion he gave in this world, after 1,825 went out in my hand with his name on it." Gervase Ashcombe put the pen down. "Then I am glad it is me," he said, and picked it up again, and go on. "You had reached the 8th of February. She was examined for an hour and 10 minutes, and she had one thing to say, and she said it in 3 parts. She began by asking that the exhibit be produced entire. Mr. Coppleston asked her what she meant by entire. "I mean the cover, sir," said Hester. "On the 5th of May I was shown a sheet of paper, and I looked at the writing on it for 4 minutes, and I did not once ask to see what it had traveled in. I have thought about that every day since. I have spent this whole business telling other people that the letter is not the evidence, and the wrapping is, and when it was my own name I looked at the words like everybody else. The cover was in the file. It was produced. Point the first," said Hester, "is the pen." She set it out as she had set it out on the table at Ellingcourt House, the spread of the split and the thin upstroke and the ragged turn and the little blot at the head of a stroke, and against it the even weight of a Birmingham nib. She put in the 73 letters, listed and dated and stamped, and she gave the court her father's blindness in 1,825, and the reason she had learned to cut a quill. And Mr. Coppleston looked at 3 of the letters himself under the glass, and did not say anything. "Point the second," said Hester, "is the frank. The cover was addressed to Mr. Vellacott in Duke Street. In the upper corner it carried a post town, a date, and a signature, the 8th of February, 1,840. The franking privilege," said Hester, "was abolished on the 10th of January, 1,840. From that morning no signature on earth carried a letter free, and the post office charged every letter that came in bearing one exactly as if it bore nothing at all. That cover was made in the Manna factory, sir, out of the stock that was standing ready before the 10th of January and could not be sold after it. It is one of the same covers I described in my affidavit in May." "And the 3rd point," said Mr. Coppleston. "The 3rd point," said Hester Loveday, "is that there is nothing on it." She held it up. "There is no charge mark. There is no date stamp. There is no receiving stamp. There is no obliteration. There is not one mark upon that cover, front or back, made by any servant of the post office in any office in England. The room was very quiet. A letter that has gone through the post cannot be clean," she said. "It is handled a dozen times. It is stamped when it goes in, and stamped again when it comes out, and charged in between, and since the 6th of May last, It is also canceled across the face. There is no route from Duke Street to any human being in this kingdom that does not leave a mark on the paper. She put it down on the table. That letter was never sent, sir. It was never carried, and it was never delivered. It was written, and it was put into a file. Mr. Coppleston took off his spectacles and did not put them on again for some time. And then Hester said the thing that she had not written down, and had not rehearsed, and had not intended to say. "He copied my hand extremely well," she said. "He had 2 years of it out of a shop in Holborn, and he missed nothing. He got my H, and he got my 8s, and he got a little dragged line I make under the last word of a paragraph that I did not know I made until I saw it on that page." She looked down the table at Ignatius Vellacott, who had not moved. "And then he signed a franc," she said, "because he has signed a franc at the corner of a cover every week for 15 years, and it did not occur to him to stop. Sir, the world changed on the 10th of January. He did not notice. Noticing is my trade. He caught her in the passage outside, afterwards, before the master's report was signed. There was nobody else in it. He had waited, which meant he had chosen the place. And Hester understood as she saw him standing there that she was about to see, for the first and only time, the thing that was actually inside Ignatius Vellacott. He was perfectly pleasant. 300 a year, he said, without any preamble at all. Settled. Not at my pleasure. A character from Mrs. Merivale in whatever words you care to write yourself, and she will sign it, and you may believe me about that. And your name comes off the file of the 5th of May, and out of every paper that printed it, which I can do, and Ellingcourt cannot." "No," said Hester. He did not become angry. He put his head very slightly on one side. "You have nothing," he said, and he said it as a simple statement of the position. "You are 29, and you have a broken wrist and no place, and no character, and £4. Whatever happens in that room this afternoon, you will be exactly the same woman at 6 o'clock. I am offering you the only thing anybody is going to offer you." "I know," said Hester. "Then why?" And she saw that he genuinely wanted to know, and that this was the strangest moment of the whole 4 months, because in 15 years of buying people, nobody had ever refused him, and he could not construct the reason. "Because you have been reading my letters for 2 years, said Hester Loveday, "and you still do not know who I am." Mr. Coppleston reported on the 15th of June. He found the will of the 12th of December in 1837 to be a forgery, and pronounced against it. He found the instrument of the 3rd of March in 1839 to be void for want of due attestation, as he had found in May. He directed that his report of the 5th of May be amended, that the affidavit of Hester Loveday be restored to the file, and that a copy of the whole be sent to the Attorney General. Ignatius Vellacott was indicted at the Old Bailey in the Michaelmas sittings for forging a will, which since the Act of 1837 was no longer a capital offense, and was sentenced to transportation for life. He was expelled from the House on the motion of a member of his own side who had never liked him. Elias Sleeth was transported for 14 years. Mr. Dunnage of Holborn was prosecuted for opening letters, and his shop was shut and his license to receive was withdrawn. The stock of covers was seized at Bristol in July, 1,900 of them, addressed in 14 imitated hands, sorted by county in a cabinet with a card index. They were laid before a committee of the House of Lords and destroyed by order in the presence of 2 clerks, and 9 men who had been quietly obedient since November of 1839 became, over the following month, extremely difficult again, and none of them ever said why. Because both wills had fallen, the Court of Chancery was obliged to appoint a guardian for Adela Wraxall itself. Hester had written to the child twice a week since the 7th of May, on Tuesdays and on Fridays, which had been her days at Holborn for 2 years and were now her days for this. She had written at first because there was nothing else on earth she could do, and she had gone on writing because a woman who receives no answer for a month and stops writing has been writing to herself. She sent them to the house in Duke Street, which was the only address she had, and she paid a penny on each one, which she could not afford and which she paid. She wrote about a boy outside a chandler's shop who had taught himself to read from the sign. She wrote about the sparrows in the drying yard and what they did with a crust and which of them was the worst tempered. She wrote about the weather at some length because there was a great deal of it that summer. She wrote about Mrs. Jeffson and what Mrs. Jeffson had said about the bread, and that Mrs. Jeffson was well and warm and was not going anywhere. Every one of those letters was opened before it was delivered. Mr. Vellacott read them himself for the first fortnight, because a letter passing between the Duke of Ellingcourt's woman and his ward was precisely the sort of thing that could be made to be worth something. He found sparrows. He found bread. He found a boy and a shop sign. After the 4th week, he stopped reading them and let them go up, because there was nothing in them, and because they occupied the child and kept her quiet, and because he had a great many other things to attend to. Mr. Coppleston went down to Duke Street on the 12th of June to see the child, as a master was bound to do, and asked her the questions a master asks. She was 8, and she answered them. He noted in his report that he had first satisfied himself that Mr. Vellacott was in every respect unfit, and that the appointment must therefore be made upon other grounds, and that among those grounds, and not the least of them, he had thought it right to record that when the infant was asked whether there was any person she wished to be with, she had named a person she had never met, who had written to her twice a week for 5 weeks, and whose letters she had kept in the bottom of a workbox, all 11 of them, in order. The court appointed Gervase Ashcombe, Duke of Ellingcourt, guardian of the person and estate of Adela Wraxall, and ordered that the infant reside at Ellingcourt House, and that the £30,000 be transferred into court. He asked her in the library on the 29th of June. She had been going there most days by then, because Adela had come on the 20th and had attached herself to Hester's left side and stayed there, and because Mrs. Jepson had come with her and had been installed in the nursery floor with a wage and a room and a great deal of opinion. He did not kneel down. He came in with a flat parcel under his arm and put it on the table and said, "Open that." Inside was a book. It was quarto, and it was bound in blue leather, and the leather was the exact color of a case she had once carried up a service passage in a house on Bryanston Square. She opened it. It was her own hand, bound in order. 73 letters about coal and committees, and the price of blankets, laid down on guards, with the dates in the margin, in his writing, and an index at the back. "I had it done in April," he said. "It was at the binder's in the week you were called a forger in 3 newspapers, and I could not decide afterwards whether it was the best or the worst thing I have ever done." Hester turned 3 of the pages. "You had my hand bound," she said, "before you knew whether I would ever speak to you again." "Next time," said Hester, "ask me before you bind it." Then he asked her, standing on the other side of the table, and he did not dress it up at all, and she said yes. She was presented at St. James's in November. It was not comfortable, and she had not expected it to be. 2 ladies whose names she knew perfectly well turned to speak to somebody else as she came up, and did it at exactly the right distance for it to be unmistakable, and exactly the wrong distance for anything to be done about it. A weekly paper had a paragraph the following Saturday which mentioned, without asserting anything, that the new Duchess of Ellingcourt had been the subject of proceedings in Chancery in the spring. Mrs. Augusta Merivale did not come. She had been invited. Hester had written the invitation herself and had addressed it herself and had not shown it to anybody, and there had been no answer, and there never was one. She did not write in November, and she did not write at Christmas, and she did not write in the following year or in any year after it. And Hester, who had gone into that house at 25 with 2 boxes and come out of it at 29 with 2 boxes, understood eventually that some things do not close. But Charlotte, Lady Atwood, who was 20 and had been told the whole story by her husband in April, and had written 4 letters to an address that no longer existed, came the length of the room in a straight line in front of 200 people, and took both of Hester's hands and did not lower her voice by 1 syllable. They were married at Ellingcourt in the spring. At the signing, the clerk laid the register on the table and set out the pen, which was a steel pen, because it was 1,841, and every parish in England had steel pens now, and only the old and the obstinate kept anything else. Hester shook her head. She opened the small bag she was carrying and took out a knife with a worn handle and 3 quills wrapped in a fold of linen, and cut a fresh point at the table in front of the clerk, the whole room, and her husband, in the way she had been taught in a kitchen in Ashburton in the winter of 1825 by a man who could no longer see his own hands. Then she wrote her name. Her wrist had never quite come back. The surgeon had said it might not, and it had not. And the downstroke of the H went slightly wide, and the last letters ran a little unevenly, and there was a small blot at the head of the first stroke where the quill had put down more than she meant. It was not a good signature. It was the worst one she had ever written in her life. Adela, standing on a hassock to see, said in a carrying whisper that it was crooked. "It is," said Hester. "Come here, and I will show you why." He had kissed her before he knew her name, but when she wrote that name out at last, unsteady and imperfect and entirely her own, he was the only person in the room who had known it from the first stroke.